In front of 50 Wall Street investors, the vice president of my company proudly took credit for the artificial intelligence model I spent 6 months building. He smiled, soaking in the applause, completely unaware that I had embedded a hidden diagnostic command deep within the core architecture. When the investors asked him to run a live simulation, he thought I would step up and save him. He did not know he was about to trigger his own federal indictment. My name is Chloe. I am 32 years old, and I work as a data scientist in Boston. Before I tell you how a single line of hidden code destroyed a corrupt executive and saved my sanity, take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments so I know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who tried to steal your hard work. The silence on the 12th floor of Origin at 6 in the morning was exactly what I needed to finish the compilation sequence for Project Sentinel. Sentinel was my masterpiece. It was an advanced predictive algorithm designed to identify critical risk factors in Phase 3 clinical trials for the FDA. I had poured every ounce of my energy into mapping the neural networks surviving on lukewarm coffee and sheer desperation. I initiated the final command to lock the source code. A gray loading bar appeared on my monitor, inching toward completion. My chest tightened with a familiar heavy anxiety, but I forced myself to stay focused. Securing this patent submission meant a guaranteed promotion, and more importantly, it meant keeping my corporate health insurance. That insurance was the only thing covering the $12,000 a month experimental Alzheimer treatment, keeping my father alive. The progress bar froze at 99%. A harsh electronic chime echoed through the empty cubicle row. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. Access denied. Administrator privileges revoked. I frowned and leaned closer to the dual monitors. I tapped the escape key and re-entered my credentials. The system rejected my password. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I opened the main server directory to check the network permissions. The root folder for Sentinel, a directory I had built from the ground up, no longer listed my employee identification number as the owner. The ownership tag had been transferred. The heavy glass door at the end of the corridor swung open. Leather dress shoes approached with a slow, deliberate rhythm on the carpet. Julian Pierce strolled into the gray light of the analytics department carrying an iced macchiato. He was the vice president of strategy, a man who spent more time playing golf with the board of directors than he ever did looking at actual data. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, radiating the unearned arrogance of someone who had never faced a real consequence in his life. He stopped right behind my chair. He took a long, noisy sip from his plastic cup, the ice rattling loudly in the quiet room. He reached over my shoulder and dropped a thick stack of printed presentation slides onto my keyboard. The heavy paper slapped against the plastic keys. I changed the network permissions overnight. Julian said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. I routed the main directory through my executive access portal. I stared at the printed slides covering my keyboard. The title page featured the Sentinel logo I had designed, but right below it, the text read Lead Architect Julian Pierce. My name was nowhere to be found. "You locked me out of my own project," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands began to tremble. "I wrote every line of that code, Julian. You do not even possess the clearance to understand the risk vectors I mapped for the FDA compliance reports." Julian chuckled. It was a low, patronizing sound that grated against my ears. He tossed his empty coffee cup into my trash can and leaned his hip against my desk, crossing one leg over the other. "Let us be realistic, Chloe. This project has grown too large for a mid-level data scientist. The investors from Wall Street need a face they can trust, someone with executive presence and leadership acumen. I will be presenting Sentinel as the lead director this Friday. You will be listed in the appendices as my technical assistant." The heavy glass door at the end of the corridor swung open. The click of the latch echoed loudly through the empty analytics department. Leather dress shoes approached with a slow and deliberate rhythm on the carpet. Julian Pierce strolled into the gray morning light of the cubicle row. He was the vice president of strategy at Origin. He carried a half-empty iced coffee from Starbucks. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit, and his hair was perfectly styled. He looked as though he had slept a full 8 hours and woken up to a personal chef. He certainly did not look like a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with complex artificial intelligence data structures, because he had not. He stopped right behind my chair. He took a long, noisy sip from his plastic cup. The ice rattled against the sides of the plastic. Without breaking eye contact, he casually tossed the empty Starbucks cup into my small metal trash can. The hollow thud echoed in the quiet space. He reached over my shoulder and dropped a thick stack of printed presentation slides directly onto my keyboard. The heavy paper slapped against the plastic keys. "I changed the network permissions overnight," Julian said. His tone was as casual and relaxed as if he were discussing his weekend golf game. I routed the main directory for Project Sentinel through my executive access portal. The ownership has been transferred to me. I stared at the printed slides covering my keyboard. The title page featured the Sentinel logo I had spent weeks designing. But right below the graphic, the bold text read, "Lead Architect Julian Pierce." My name was nowhere to be found. He had completely wiped my existence from the system. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. "You locked me out of my own project," I said. I kept my voice steady even though my hands began to tremble. "I wrote every single line of that code, Julian. You do not even possess the technical clearance to understand the risk vectors I mapped for the clinical trials." Julian chuckled. It was a low and patronizing sound that made my blood run cold. He leaned his hip against my desk and crossed one leg over the other. "Chloe, let us be realistic," he said smoothly. "This project has grown entirely too large for a mid-level data scientist. The board of directors needs a face they can trust. They need someone with executive presence and polished leadership. I will be presenting Sentinel as the lead director on Friday. You will be listed in the appendices as my technical assistant." I stood up and pushed my chair back. The wheels caught sharply on the carpet. "You are stealing my intellectual property," I told him. "I will take this straight to the managing partners. I will pull the version history logs and show them exactly who authored the system." Julian did not flinch. His arrogant smirk faded and was replaced by a cold and calculating stare. He set his hands flat on my desk and leaned in. He trapped me between his arms. He lowered his voice and let the total silence of the empty office amplify his threat. "You can try to go to management," Julian whispered. His breath smelled of stale espresso and peppermint. "But who do you think they will actually believe? A rising star on the executive track or a data clerk who is drowning in medical debt?" I pressed my back against the fabric partition of my cubicle. He knew. He knew about my father. He knew about the $12,000 a month the company health insurance was paying for the experimental Alzheimer treatment. Julian tilted his head and watched the horrific realization wash over my face. He was weaponizing my personal tragedy. He was twisting my absolute desperation into a liability. "If you make a scene, you will not just be fired," Julian continued. "I will make sure you are blacklisted across the entire biotech sector in Boston. Good luck paying those massive hospital bills when you are completely unemployable." He stepped back and casually adjusted his silk tie. His posture shifted right back to the polished corporate golden boy. "Be a team player, Chloe. Help me prep the slides for the board meeting. Once I get my promotion to senior vice president, I will make sure you get a nice little bonus, maybe even enough to cover one of your pharmacy copays." He patted my shoulder with a condescending tap that made my skin crawl. "Do not do anything stupid," he said. He turned and walked away. His leather shoes patted softly against the carpet, leaving me entirely alone in the dim light of my cubicle. I looked down at the presentation slides on my desk. The crisp white paper felt incredibly heavy. It was loaded with the weight of my stolen labor. My breathing grew shallow. The panic tightened around my throat and squeezed the air from my lungs. He had boxed me into a perfect trap. If I fought him, I lost my job and my father lost his treatment. If I surrendered, I lost my dignity and my creation. I looked at the metal trash can. The empty Starbucks cup sat there as a mocking reminder of how little effort he had put into destroying my life. I pushed my chair back with a sharp shove. The wheels caught on the carpet, but I forced myself to stand up. I was not going to sit there and let a man who barely understood basic statistics steal my life's work. I looked Julian dead in the eye. "You cannot present Project Sentinel," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was hard and flat. "You do not even know what the core infrastructure is built on. If you stand in front of Elias Thorne and the Wall Street investors, they will tear you apart in 5 minutes." Julian rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. It was the theatrical sigh of a parent dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Chloe," he said smoothly, "I do not need to know how the engine is built to drive the sports car. I know how to sell it. That is what matters to the board. You cannot sell a predictive medical algorithm with empty marketing buzzwords. Julian, I fired back. I stepped out from behind my desk, closing the distance between us. This is not a real estate pitch. This is a vital compliance tool. Sentinel predicts mortality risk in Phase 3 clinical trials. If you do not understand the data ingestion process, you will misinterpret the output. Tell me, Julian, how does the system filter out the false positive anomalies in the control group? The smug smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He did not know. He did not even know what a false positive anomaly in a control group meant. For a brief moment, I saw the profound depth of his ignorance. He was completely out of his depth, and he knew it. You are going to humiliate this company, I warned him. When Elias Thorne asks you to explain the time series regression logic, what are you going to say? You cannot even write a basic Python script. You are going to stand at that podium and destroy a $2 billion merger because your ego could not handle letting a woman take the credit. Julian did not back down. Instead, his expression darkened. The polished corporate golden boy vanished completely. He stepped toward me, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. He leaned in so close I could see the faint pulse beating at his temple. He was angry now. I had bruised his fragile ego. And a mediocre man with a bruised ego is the most dangerous creature in any corporate office. You talk too much, Chloe, Julian whispered. His voice was a venomous hiss. You think your little coding skills make you irreplaceable. You think because you understand the math you hold the power. Let me explain how the real world operates. Power is not about who writes the code. Power is about who controls the resources. And right now, I control yours. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He slowly withdrew a folded piece of paper and held it up between us. It was not a technical schematic. It was a printed invoice. I recognized the logo at the top immediately. It was the billing department of the Massachusetts General Hospital. My heart stopped. The blood drained from my face so fast I felt dizzy. Your father has early onset Alzheimer's, Julian stated. He did not ask a question. He delivered a verdict. He is currently enrolled in a highly exclusive experimental treatment program. The medication alone costs $12,000 a month. That is $144,000 a year. Without the premium corporate health insurance provided by Origen, you would be bankrupt in 30 days, and your father would be dropped from the trial immediately. I stared at the invoice. My hands went numb. How did you get that? I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. That is confidential medical information. Julian offered a slow and terrifying smile. Vanessa in Human Resources is a very close friend of mine, he replied smoothly. She understands the importance of executive alignment. We were reviewing employee benefits last night, and your file happened to cross her desk. It is a shame, really. Such a heavy burden for a junior data scientist to carry all alone. I was sleeping with the director of Human Resources. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The entire system was rigged. The people designed to protect employees were the exact same people conspiring to extort them. If you walk into that boardroom and open your mouth, Julian continued, his voice dropping into a soft and lethal cadence, I will not just fire you. Vanessa will categorize your termination as gross misconduct. You will lose your health insurance by 5 in the afternoon. The hospital will cancel your father's treatment by Monday morning. You will have to watch his memory completely disintegrate because you were too proud to share a computer project. The air in the room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The walls of my cubicle seemed to close in around me. He had found the one vulnerability I could not protect. He had taken my deepest trauma and forged it into a weapon. You are a monster, I breathed. The tears stung the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I am a vice president, Julian corrected himself, adjusting his cuffs. And you are my technical assistant. You are going to format my slides. You are going to stand in the corner of that boardroom on Friday. You are going to operate the slide clicker, and you are going to smile while I secure this merger. If you try to sabotage my presentation, I will end your father's life. He dropped the hospital invoice onto my desk, right on top of the stolen presentation slides. He turned his back on me and walked away. I stood perfectly still. I listened to his leather shoes padding softly against the carpet until the sound faded completely. The panic that gripped my throat was absolute. I was trapped in a nightmare. But as I looked down at the medical bill sitting on top of my stolen work, the panic began to harden. It solidified into something cold and sharp and dangerous. Julian thought he was holding my life in his hands. He did not know he had just given me a reason to burn his entire world to the ground. Julian did not try to argue the mathematics. He did not defend his lack of knowledge regarding the artificial intelligence infrastructure. He knew he was completely outmatched on the technical details, and he simply did not care. The polished and charismatic facade vanished in an instant. He took a slow and deliberate step forward, closing the small distance between us. He moved directly into my personal space, forcing me to step back until my shoulders hit the cold fabric of the cubicle partition. The suffocating scent of his expensive cedar cologne filled my lungs. He leaned down so his face was only inches from mine. When he spoke, his voice was completely devoid of its usual booming corporate confidence. It dropped into a low and chilling whisper. "You think this is a college debate, Chloe. You think whoever understands the code gets the prize. You are incredibly naive. Power in this building has absolutely nothing to do with regression logic or predictive modeling. Power is about leverage, and right now I hold all of yours." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He pressed it flat against the desk right on top of my keyboard. I recognized the logo printed at the top immediately. It was from the billing department of the Boston Neurological Institute. My stomach dropped. The blood turned to ice in my veins. "Your father has been doing remarkably well in his experimental Alzheimer treatment," Julian murmured. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and devoid of any human empathy. "It is a highly competitive clinical trial, and an incredibly expensive one. $12,000 a month. That is a massive financial burden for a single woman in her early 30s to carry." My hands started to shake. "How did you access my confidential family medical files?" I demanded. My voice was a breathless rasp. Julian smiled a razor-thin line across his face. "Origen is a self-insured corporation, Chloe. The executive suite tracks the highest expenditure accounts to monitor our bottom line. Your father is currently kept alive by the premium-tier health insurance provided by this company. Without that insurance policy, the hospital will discharge him in less than a week. The trial will drop him instantly. You do not have $12,000 a month to pay out of pocket. If you are terminated for gross insubordination, your benefits end on the exact same day." He tapped the medical invoice with his index finger. The crisp sound echoed like a ticking clock in the silent room. "You are not going to report me to anyone," Julian said smoothly. "You are going to format my presentation slides. You are going to stand quietly in the back of the boardroom on Friday and run the diagnostic visuals while I pitch your project to the investors. If you speak one word of this to the CEO, I will have you escorted out of the building by security. Your father will lose his treatment, and his memory will completely fade away because of your stubborn pride. The choice is entirely yours." The medical invoice resting on my keyboard was not just a piece of paper. It was the only tether holding my father to this world. I stared at the $12,000 charge and felt the remaining air leave my lungs. The experimental Alzheimer medication was actually working. For the first time in 2 years, my father had recognized my face last Sunday. He had said my name. It was a fragile and beautiful miracle funded entirely by my corporate health insurance. Julian knew that if I quit my job or if he fired me for insubordination, my benefits would be terminated by the end of the business day. The clinic would drop my father from the trial immediately. The medication would stop, and his mind would dissolve into complete darkness. Julian had not just found a vulnerable pressure point. He had found a loaded gun and pressed it directly against my temple. I stood paralyzed in the narrow cubicle. Julian watched the fight completely drain from my posture. He smiled. It was the cold and deeply satisfied smile of a predator, watching its prey finally surrender. He reached out and tapped the presentation portfolio on my desk. "You are going to be a good team player," Chloe, Julian whispered. His voice was smooth and perfectly controlled. "The Wall Street investors are flying in this Friday. We are presenting Project Sentinel to finalize a $2 billion merger with Elias Thorne and his executive board. That algorithm is going to secure my position as senior vice president, and you are going to help me do it." I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter humiliation in the back of my throat. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow and entirely defeated. Julian straightened his jacket and looked down at me with absolute contempt. "You are going to format every single slide in my deck to perfection," he instructed. "And when Friday morning arrives, you are going to put on a nice professional suit and walk into that executive boardroom. But you will not sit at the table. You will stand quietly in the back corner in the shadows where you belong. You will act as my technical assistant. You will operate the slide clicker, and you will smile politely while I pitch the architecture to the investors. I want you to watch me close a $2 billion deal using the system you built. If you do exactly as you are told and keep your mouth shut, your father gets to keep his medicine. If you try to play the hero, I will destroy your career and end his treatment before lunch." He did not wait for my response. He knew he did not need one. He turned and walked down the corridor, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of his extortion. I was completely trapped. He was forcing me to act as his silent servant while he stole the greatest achievement of my life. I sank back into my office chair and stared at the red access denied message still flashing on my monitor. Julian thought he had won. He thought my silence was guaranteed. But as the initial shock began to fade, a cold and mechanical logic took over my mind. He was right about one thing. I was going to be in that boardroom on Friday. But I was not going to be a victim. I was going to be his executioner. I watched Julian walk away until his tailored suit disappeared around the corner of the cubicle row. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the cold plastic edge of my desk just to keep myself standing. The $12,000 medical invoice was still sitting right on top of my keyboard. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to crush the breath right out of my lungs. I had to calm down. I had to stop reacting like a frightened subordinate and start thinking like a senior software engineer. Julian was a vice president of strategy. He had immense corporate power and incredible leverage over my life. But he was not a system administrator. He was a salesman who played golf with board members and threw around technical buzzwords he did not actually comprehend. He might have possessed the executive clearance to change the surface-level permissions on the Sentinel directory, but he could not erase the foundational metadata. Every single time I compiled that code over the last 6 months, the system generated an immutable timestamp. Those timestamps were permanently linked directly to my unique employee identification number. The raw server logs were the ultimate undeniable proof of my authorship. If I could get the information technology department to pull the back-end commit history before Julian figured out how to delete it, I would have absolute irrefutable evidence of his corporate theft. I grabbed my employee identification badge from my desk drawer and ran out of the analytics department. I completely ignored the confused stares of my coworkers as I rushed past their desks. My low heels clicked frantically against the polished linoleum floor, echoing loudly in the quiet morning air. I did not wait for the elevator. I pushed through the heavy fire doors and took the stairwell down to the 9th floor. The 9th floor was the central nervous system of Origen. It housed the main server infrastructure and the entire technical support division. Normally, this floor was a chaotic and noisy hive of activity filled with technicians debugging software and monitoring the network traffic. But as I stepped out of the stairwell, the main corridor was eerily quiet. I hurried toward the massive glass double doors of the Network Administration Center. I raised my plastic badge and pressed it flat against the electronic scanner mounted on the wall. A harsh red light blinked twice in rapid succession. A low and angry electronic buzz indicated that my access was denied. I swiped the card again, pushing it harder against the plastic reader. The red light flashed again. Denied. I grabbed the heavy metal handle and pulled with all my strength, but the door was locked magnetically from the inside. I cupped my hands against the tinted glass and peered inside. I could see the massive automated server racks blinking in the dark server room, but the entire support floor was completely abandoned. There was not a single technician in sight. A cold and terrifying realization washed over me. Julian had not just altered my personal project permissions. He had executed a total departmental lockdown. As a vice president, he had the executive authority to freeze all access to the back-end infrastructure under the guise of an emergency security audit. He was deliberately sealing off the digital crime scene before I could even gather my evidence. He had anticipated my exact tactical move, and he had suffocated it flawlessly. My chest tightened with a fresh wave of panic. I was losing the digital war before I could even fire a single shot. But Origen was a massive publicly traded biotechnology company. We operated under strict federal oversight. Corporate espionage and intellectual property theft were severe violations of our employee code of conduct. If the technological network was locked down, I had to escalate the situation through the official corporate hierarchy. I had to take my fight to human resources. I turned away from the locked glass doors and sprinted back toward the main elevator bank. I pressed the up button repeatedly, my finger jabbing the plastic panel. When the polished steel doors finally opened, I stepped inside and hit the button for the 15th floor. The 15th floor housed the Executive Human Resources Suite. The elevator ride felt like an agonizing eternity. I leaned my back against the cold mirrored wall and forced myself to take slow and deliberate breaths. I rehearsed exactly what I was going to say. I would maintain my composure. I would report a critical breach of corporate protocol. I would demand an immediate independent audit of the Sentinel architecture. The Human Resources Department existed to protect the company from massive legal liabilities and public scandals. A senior executive stealing a predictive medical algorithm right before a $2 billion merger with Wall Street investors was a catastrophic liability. They had to listen to the facts. The elevator chimed softly and the doors slid open. I stepped out onto the plush beige carpet of the executive suite. The air up here felt entirely different. It smelled of expensive linen room spray and hushed corporate secrets. I walked directly past the empty reception desk, ignoring the sign asking visitors to sign in. I headed straight for the large corner office belonging to Vanessa Cole. She was the director of human resources and the ultimate authority on employee grievances. I reached for the heavy mahogany door. My heart was pounding a frantic and uneven rhythm against my ribs. I turned the brass handle and pushed the door open, stepping inside with my chin held high. I was ready to fight for my career and for my father. But the words died instantly in my throat the second I crossed the threshold. Vanessa Cole was sitting perfectly upright behind her sprawling glass desk, wearing a pristine white blazer. And sitting comfortably on the plush leather sofa directly across from her was Julian Pierce. He had his legs crossed casually at the ankle. He held a crystal glass of sparkling water in his right hand. He took a slow sip and looked over the rim of the glass directly at me. He was smiling. It was the dark and victorious smile of a hunter who had just watched his prey run willingly into a steel trap. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind me with a loud, definitive click. I was locked inside the room with the very people orchestrating my destruction. I took a deep breath and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. I expected to find Vanessa Cole sitting alone at her desk, ready to take my formal complaint. I expected the rigid machinery of corporate compliance to activate and protect me from a rogue executive. But as I stepped onto the thick carpet, the air in the room felt instantly suffocating. Vanessa was sitting perfectly upright behind her sprawling glass desk. She wore a pristine white blazer, and her hands were folded neatly over a blank legal pad. She did not look surprised to see me. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy. Then my eyes moved toward the corner of the office. Sitting comfortably on the plush leather sofa was Julian Pierce. He had his legs casually crossed at the ankle, looking like a king holding court in his own private castle. He held a crystal glass of iced water in his right hand. He swirled the water slowly, and the ice clinked against the glass with a sharp and mocking sound that cut through the silence. He took a slow sip and looked at me over the rim of the glass. He was smiling. It was the dark and victorious smile of a hunter who had just watched his prey run willingly right into a steel trap. He had beaten me here. He had orchestrated this entire encounter before I even stepped onto the elevator. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind me. The automatic deadbolt engaged with a loud and definitive snap that echoed through the soundproof office. My heart plummeted into my stomach. The panic I had been trying to suppress came rushing back with paralyzing force. I had run to Human Resources for help. I had run to the exact department that was supposed to protect the employees from retaliation. But as I stood frozen in the center of that room, looking at Julian and Vanessa, exchanging a knowing glance, I realized the horrifying truth. There was no rescue coming. The shield of corporate justice did not exist for people like me. I was locked inside a soundproof room with the very monsters who had conspired to destroy my life. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the soundproof executive office. I stood frozen on the thick beige carpet. Julian Pierce sat casually on the plush leather sofa, swirling his iced water, while Vanessa Cole, the director of human resources, sat rigidly behind her sprawling glass desk. The air in the room was heavy and suffocating. It smelled of expensive floral perfume and corporate malice. I forced myself to walk forward. I was not going to let them intimidate me. I approached the glass desk and placed my hands flat on the cold surface. "I am filing a formal grievance against Julian Pierce," I stated. I kept my voice as steady and professional as I possibly could. "He has illegally revoked my administrative access to Project Sentinel. He altered the ownership metadata in the primary directory, and he is actively attempting to steal my intellectual property to present to Elias Thorne and the Wall Street investors this Friday. I demand an immediate independent forensic audit of the server logs to prove my authorship." I expected Vanessa to open her leather-bound notebook. I expected her to pull out a silver pen and begin documenting my serious allegations. That was her job. She was the shield designed to protect the company from legal liability and internal corruption. But Vanessa did not pick up a pen. She did not even flinch. She simply looked at me with a pair of cold, calculating eyes that lacked a single ounce of human empathy. She tilted her head and offered a tight, practiced smile that made my stomach churn. "Chloe, please sit down," Vanessa said. Her tone was smooth and dangerously calm. It was the voice of a predator masquerading as a peacemaker. "We have a much more pressing issue to discuss this morning." I did not sit down. I gripped the edge of the glass desk until my knuckles turned white. "You are not listening to me," I insisted. "Julian is committing corporate espionage against his own firm. If he stands in front of the investors and tries to explain the Phase 3 clinical trial risk vectors, the entire merger will collapse. He does not understand the underlying mathematical code." Vanessa unclasped her hands. She reached into the top drawer of her desk. The metal track glided silently in the quiet room. She withdrew a thick manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the glass surface between us. She did not open it immediately. She let it sit there, allowing the weight of the document to command the room. "Actually, Chloe, we have already conducted a forensic audit of the analytics department," Vanessa explained. Her voice dropped an octave, taking on a clinical and warning edge. "The internal security team initiated a sweep of your workstation late last night, and the preliminary findings are incredibly disturbing." She flipped open the heavy paper cover. Inside lay a dense stack of printed reports covered in complex data strings and highlighted network addresses. I stared at the papers. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was talking about. I had nothing to hide. I had spent the last 6 months practically living in my narrow cubicle, doing nothing but building the algorithm that was going to save this biotechnology company. "The security logs indicate that at 2 a.m, you initiated an unauthorized mass download of the Sentinel core architecture," Vanessa read flatly. She traced a perfectly manicured finger down the column of fabricated data. "You bypassed the internal firewall and transferred highly classified predictive models to an unencrypted external hard drive. You attempted to steal proprietary biotechnology assets belonging to Origen." The blood drained from my face entirely. I felt physically dizzy as the walls of the office seemed to close in. "That is a complete and utter lie," I fired back. My voice vibrated with absolute disbelief. "I was asleep in my apartment at 2 a.m. I never transferred any files to an external drive. You are fabricating server logs to cover up his theft." I pointed a shaking finger at Julian, who was still sitting comfortably on the sofa. Julian let out a heavy theatrical sigh. He set his crystal glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured disappointment. "Chloe, I really tried to protect you," Julian said. His voice dripped with fake sympathy. "When the automated fail-safes alerted me to your massive data breach, I did not want to believe it. You were my best data scientist. I mentored you. I brought you onto this project hoping you could handle the high-stakes pressure. But stealing company secrets is a federal crime. I had no choice but to bring this severe violation directly to human resources." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his psychological manipulation made the room spin. He had orchestrated a flawless and lethal trap. He had stolen my project, locked me out of the digital system, and then used his secret relationship with the human resources director to frame me for the exact crime he was currently committing. They were building an ironclad narrative to completely destroy my professional credibility. "Why would I steal my own project?" I demanded, looking frantically back and forth between Julian and Vanessa. "This makes absolutely no sense. I am the lead architect. I have no reason to sabotage my own hard work right before a major acquisition." Vanessa closed the manila folder and folded her hands on top of it. She leveled a harsh and assessing glare in my direction. Motive is rarely a mystery in these unfortunate cases, Chloe Vanessa stated coldly. We are very aware of your current personal situation. We know about your father. We know about his aggressive early-onset Alzheimer's disease. And we know that his experimental neurological treatments cost $12,000 a month. The sudden mention of my father felt like a physical strike to my chest. They were using my deepest personal trauma to build their fake prosecution. You are drowning in massive medical debt, Vanessa continued, her voice completely devoid of mercy. You are desperate. Desperate employees make reckless and illegal decisions. The evidence strongly suggests that you intended to sell the Sentinel algorithm to a rival biotechnology firm in order to pay off your father's hospital bills. You intentionally compromised a $2 billion merger for your own financial gain. I could not breathe. The suffocation reached its absolute peak. They had mapped out every single pressure point I possessed. They had taken my dedication, my brilliant code, and my heartbreaking family tragedy and twisted them into a horrific narrative of corporate treason. If I tried to claim that Julian stole my work, I would just sound like a desperate, guilty employee trying to deflect blame. Who would the chief executive officer believe? A wealthy, charismatic vice president and the director of human resources, or a junior data scientist drowning in medical debt who had just been caught stealing classified files? The corporate game had been rigged long before I ever stepped off the elevator. Julian was not just holding my health insurance over my head anymore. He and Vanessa had built a digital guillotine. They were threatening me with federal prison. I am completely innocent, I whispered. The tears finally burned the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You cannot do this. You have no real proof because it never happened. Vanessa offered a cold and sickeningly sweet smile. We have the internal audit reports right here, Chloe. In the eyes of the corporate hierarchy and the federal authorities, this is all the proof we need. Now we have to discuss the immediate consequences of your actions. Vanessa did not raise her voice. She did not have to. The quiet and clinical way she spoke made the accusation infinitely more terrifying. She traced a perfectly manicured finger over the fabricated audit report resting on the glass desk. The security logs indicate a massive and unauthorized data extraction originating from your terminal late last night, Chloe. According to this report, you bypassed the internal firewall and downloaded the entire proprietary architecture of Project Sentinel onto an unencrypted external drive. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. I tried to speak, but my throat was entirely dry. That is impossible, I whispered. You know I did not do that. Vanessa ignored my denial completely. She closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it, looking at me with eyes that held absolutely zero pity. Corporate espionage is not a new phenomenon in the biotechnology sector, she continued smoothly. When a flagship project like Sentinel is on the verge of securing a $2 billion acquisition from Wall Street investors, rival companies are willing to pay a fortune for a stolen copy of the algorithm. And we know exactly why you would be tempted by such a lucrative offer. She tilted her head and offered a sickeningly sympathetic smile. We are fully aware of your father and his early-onset Alzheimer's disease. We know that the experimental clinical trial he is enrolled in costs $12,000 every single month. That is a crushing amount of medical debt for a junior data scientist to manage. The narrative is quite clear to anyone reviewing this file. The immense pressure of your financial obligations finally broke you. You became desperate, and a desperate employee with access to highly classified predictive models is a massive liability. You intended to steal the Sentinel data and sell it to our primary competitor in order to pay off your father's medical bills. I felt the blood rush to my ears. A sickening wave of vertigo washed over me. They were not just trying to fire me, they were building an ironclad federal case against me. They had taken my late nights of agonizing labor and twisted them into a story of corporate treason. They had taken the tragic deterioration of my father's mind and weaponized it as the perfect motive for a crime I never committed. Julian sat quietly on the sofa behind me, taking another slow sip of his iced water. I was letting Vanessa do the executioner work. If I tried to expose his theft now, I would simply look like a guilty and desperate thief trying to shift the blame onto a respected senior executive. They had backed me into a corner where the only available exit led straight to federal prison. Vanessa opened the second drawer of her sprawling glass desk. The metal track glided silently in the heavy atmosphere of the soundproof office. She withdrew 2 crisp white documents and placed them side by side on the cold glass surface. The first document had a bold, aggressive heading printed across the top: Performance Improvement Plan. The second document was much thicker, bound by a heavy staple in the corner: Non-Disclosure Agreement and Transfer of Intellectual Property. I stared down at the papers. The black corporate ink looked like a death sentence. The words blurred together under the harsh fluorescent lights of the executive suite. "We are offering you a choice, Chloe," Vanessa said. Her voice was steady and remarkably calm. It was the polished, practiced tone of a corporate assassin who had executed this exact maneuver a dozen times before. Origen is a compassionate company. We recognize the extreme psychological stress you are under regarding your father and his rapidly deteriorating health. We prefer to handle this internal disciplinary matter quietly, without destroying your future and without involving federal authorities. She reached out with one perfectly manicured finger and pushed the first document toward me. "The Performance Improvement Plan requires you to accept a full and immediate demotion to a technical assistant role," Vanessa explained smoothly. "You will report directly to Julian. You will assist him in all preparations for the Wall Street investor presentation this Friday. You will format his slides, run his diagnostic checks, and follow his exact instructions without question." Then she placed her hand flat on the thick stack of papers and pushed it forward. "The non-disclosure agreement is absolute," Vanessa continued. "By signing this document, you legally forfeit any and all claims to the authorship of Project Sentinel. You acknowledge Julian Pierce as the sole lead architect of the algorithm. You agree to transfer all proprietary rights, patents, and equity shares directly to his name. Furthermore, you agree to never discuss this project, your temporary reassignment, or the details of this meeting with anyone inside or outside of this biotechnology firm. If you violate this agreement in any capacity, you will be sued for millions in financial damages, and your father will be held legally liable as your dependent." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. A violent tremor started in my hands, and I had to press them hard against my thighs to hide the shaking. "You are asking me to sign away my entire career," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow, completely drained of its usual strength. "You want me to hand him my algorithm and become his silent, obedient servant." Julian shifted on this plush leather sofa. He crossed his arms over his tailored chest and smiled. The sheer malice in his eyes was unmistakable. "We are not asking you, Chloe," he said softly. "We are dictating the terms of your survival." Vanessa picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from her desk organizer and held it out to me. The polished metal gleamed under the overhead lights. "If you sign these documents today, your employment continues uninterrupted," Vanessa stated. "Your corporate health insurance remains active. Your father receives his experimental Alzheimer treatment tomorrow morning just as scheduled. The company will permanently bury the fabricated audit report and classify your massive data breach as a simple technical error. Nobody outside of this room will ever know." She paused, letting the profound silence of the office amplify the alternative. The air felt incredibly thin, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "But if you refuse to sign," Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a lethal and terrifying whisper, "I will pick up this telephone right now. I will call the federal authorities. I will hand the FBI the security audit report, proving you attempted to steal proprietary biotechnology assets to sell to our competitors. You will be arrested for felony data sabotage before you can even reach the lobby. You will face up to 20 years in a federal prison." I looked at the sleek black telephone sitting on the corner of her glass desk. The small green light on the console blinked steadily. It was a direct line to my absolute ruin. "If you go to federal prison," Julian added, his voice dripping with fake pity, "who is going to pay the hospital bills? Your father will be discharged immediately. He will spend his final months in a state-funded facility completely stripped of his dignity and his memories. He will not even remember your name by the time you go to trial, and you will be sitting in a jail cell, unable to do a single thing to help him." The claustrophobia was absolute. They had built an inescapable cage out of my own love for my family. They were using my dying father as collateral in a multi-billion-dollar corporate heist. I looked at Julian sitting on the sofa. He was watching me with a look of pure sadistic enjoyment. He loved the power dynamic. He thrived on watching a competent, intelligent woman completely break down under his control. He believed he was invincible because the system was designed to protect men exactly like him. I bit the inside of my lower lip. I bit down so hard that the delicate skin broke. The sharp metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. The sudden burst of physical pain grounded me just enough to keep me from passing out. I looked down at the documents resting on the glass desk. The non-disclosure agreement was dense with aggressive legal clauses designed to completely silence me and erase my existence. It was a gag order funded by extortion. "Sign the papers," Chloe Vanessa commanded. Her professional facade slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the sheer ruthless ambition underneath. "Sign them right now or I make the phone call." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely open my fingers. I reached out and took the heavy silver pen from her hand. The metal felt like ice against my skin. I lowered the tip of the pen to the signature line on the performance improvement plan. My vision blurred with unshed tears, but I forced myself to focus on the black line. I dragged the blue ink across the paper. I signed my name. I moved the pen to the thick non-disclosure agreement. With every single stroke of the pen, I was giving away 6 months of agonizing labor. I was giving away my genius, my late-night coding sessions, and the algorithm that was going to fundamentally change the medical industry. I was officially erasing myself from my own masterpiece. I signed the final page and dropped the pen onto the glass desk. It clattered loudly, breaking the tense silence of the room. Vanessa pulled the documents back immediately. She inspected the signatures with a highly satisfied nod. She opened a pristine file folder and slid my formal surrender safely inside. "I am glad we could reach a mutual alignment, Chloe," Vanessa said, returning to her fake professional and courteous smile. "We truly value your continued contribution to this company." Julian stood up from the leather sofa. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive navy suit and walked slowly over to me. He leaned in close, his breath brushing against my ear. "Have my presentation slides formatted and perfectly aligned by the end of the day," he whispered. "And remember your place on Friday morning. Stand in the shadows. Do not speak unless you are spoken to." I did not look at him. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the empty glass desk. The taste of blood was still sharp in my mouth. I had surrendered. I had signed my own professional death warrant to keep my father alive. But deep inside the suffocating despair, a tiny cold spark of logic remained untouched. They thought a signed piece of paper could erase the past. They thought a legal threat could rewrite the core architecture of a machine I built from scratch. They were corporate bureaucrats who operated in boardrooms and printed memos. I operated in source code, and source code never lies. Vanessa leaned forward and rested her hands flat against the cold glass of her desk. Her voice did not raise. It did not have to. The quiet and clinical menace in her tone filled every corner of the soundproof office. "We have laid out the options, Chloe," she said smoothly. "It is a very simple choice. If you pick up that silver pen and sign the non-disclosure agreement, you will legally forfeit any and all claims to the Sentinel project. You will acknowledge Julian as the sole lead architect of the artificial intelligence model. You will keep your mouth shut. You will step into the role of his technical assistant, and you will do exactly what he tells you to do without a single complaint." I stared down at the thick stack of legal papers. The black corporate ink looked exactly like a death sentence. "You are asking me to become his servant," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow and completely drained of its usual strength. "You want me to hand him the greatest achievement of my professional life and just fade away into the background." Julian took another slow sip of his iced water. The ice rattled loudly against the crystal glass. "We are not asking you, Chloe," he said from the leather sofa. "We are telling you." Vanessa tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the corner of the performance improvement plan. "The alternative is much less pleasant," she continued. "If you refuse to sign these documents right now, I will pick up the black telephone on my desk. I will contact the federal authorities. I will hand the federal agents the security audit proving that you attempted to steal highly classified biotechnology assets to sell to a rival firm." My heart hammered a frantic and erratic rhythm against my ribs. "You cannot do that," I said, my hands trembling at my sides. "It is a complete lie." "It is a documented corporate audit," Vanessa countered. Her eyes turned completely flat and devoid of any human mercy. "You will be arrested right here in the lobby of this building. You will be charged with felony data sabotage. The prosecution will argue that you compromised a $2 billion medical merger out of sheer financial desperation. You will face up to 20 years in a federal prison." The walls of the executive office felt like they were rapidly closing in. The invisible pressure was crushing the oxygen right out of my lungs. Julian stood up from the sofa. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored navy suit and walked slowly over to the glass desk. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the Human Resources Director, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate corruption. "And let us think about your father," Julian added. His voice dropped into a soft and lethal cadence. "If you are arrested for a federal felony, your health insurance is terminated immediately. The clinical trial will drop him before you even make bail. His treatment will stop. His memory will completely dissolve. He will forget your own name while you sit in a concrete jail cell. All because you were too proud and too stubborn to share a computer project." The claustrophobia was absolute. They had built a flawless and inescapable trap. They had taken my brilliant code, my late nights of agonizing labor, and my desperate love for my dying father, and turned them into the steel bars of a cage. If I signed the papers, I lost my dignity, my creation, and my future. If I refused to sign, I lost my freedom, and my father lost his life. They had backed me into a corner where the only available exit led straight to my own destruction. The silence inside the soundproof executive office was absolute. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. The thick glass windows shut out the noise of the Boston traffic, entirely leaving me trapped in a suffocating vacuum with Julian and Vanessa. I tried to pull a breath into my lungs, but the oxygen felt incredibly thin. Panic was a living creature clawing at the inside of my throat. I looked at the sleek black telephone sitting on the desk. A single push of a button would summon the federal agents. A single push of a button would end my father treatment and essentially end his life. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I saw my father sitting in his hospital room struggling to remember how to hold a spoon. I saw the brief, beautiful flash of recognition in his eyes when the experimental medicine finally cleared the fog from his brain. He was fighting so hard to hold on to his memories. I could not be the reason he lost them forever. I opened my eyes. I bit down on my lower lip. I bit down so fiercely that the delicate skin ruptured. A sharp, metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. The sudden burst of physical pain was grounding. It cut through the paralyzing terror and forced me to focus. I looked at the heavy silver pen resting on the glass desk next to the non-disclosure agreement. It did not look like a writing instrument. It looked like a weapon designed to execute my career. My right hand trembled violently as I reached forward. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal barrel of the pen. It felt like holding a block of solid ice. I pulled the documents closer to the edge of the desk. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to fight back, to expose their lies. But I swallowed the blood in my mouth and lowered the pen to the paper. I dragged the blue ink across the signature line. I signed away my masterpiece. I signed away my dignity. I surrendered my entire professional existence just to buy my father another month of memories. The heavy silver pen slipped from my fingers and hit the glass desk with a dull thud. It was done. The dark blue ink was already drying on the final page of the non-disclosure agreement. Vanessa reached out and pulled the thick stack of legal papers toward her with a look of immense and terrifying satisfaction. She carefully aligned the edges of the documents and slipped them into a pristine manila folder, locking my entire future away in the dark. Julian did not even bother to look at me anymore. He was already staring at the bright screen of his mobile phone, dismissing my existence entirely now that he had successfully stolen my algorithm. I turned around and walked toward the heavy mahogany door. My legs felt like they were made of solid lead. Every single step required a massive amount of conscious physical effort. I reached out and pulled the heavy brass handle. The electronic deadbolt clicked open, and I stepped out of the soundproof trap. The door swung shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating silence of the executive suite. The sudden noise of the main corporate floor hit me like a physical blow. Telephones were ringing loudly in the distance. Keyboards were clattering as dozens of analysts typed away at their workstations. People were standing by the glass water cooler discussing their weekend plans and complaining about the terrible coffee in the cafeteria. It was a perfectly normal Wednesday morning at the Origen headquarters. Nobody on this floor knew that a massive corporate theft had just occurred right behind that heavy wooden door. Nobody knew that my entire professional life had just been completely erased. I walked slowly down the long corridor, keeping my head perfectly level. I focused my eyes entirely on the gray carpet directly in front of my shoes. I knew that if I made eye contact with anyone, I would completely fall apart. I was a ghost walking through a world I no longer belonged to. I had built the complex predictive models that powered this entire department, but now I was nothing more than an obedient technical assistant to a man I absolutely despised. I reached the end of the long corridor and pushed my way into the women's restroom. The bright fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the white tile. The room was completely empty. I walked straight to the nearest sink and turned on the cold water. I leaned over and splashed the freezing water directly onto my face. The sharp chill shocked my nervous system and finally stopped the violent trembling in my hands. I stood up straight and gripped the edges of the cold porcelain sink, staring directly at my own reflection in the wide mirror. My face was incredibly pale and hollow. There was a faint smear of bright red on my lower lip where I had bitten deeply through the skin. I wiped the dried blood away with the back of my hand. I had to survive this nightmare. I had to go back to my narrow cubicle and pretend everything was perfectly fine. I had to format the presentation slides for Julian and run his diagnostic checks without showing a single ounce of anger or rebellion. I had to play the role of the defeated employee perfectly until the investor presentation on Friday morning. That was the absolute only way to keep my father safe and ensure his medical treatments continued. I took a deep, ragged breath and smoothed the deep wrinkles out of my white blouse. I turned away from the mirror and walked out of the restroom. I headed directly toward the main elevator bank to return to the analytics department on the lower floor. I pressed the glowing down button and watched the digital floor indicator flash above the heavy metal doors. Just as the elevator arrived with a soft digital chime, a sudden and sharp vibration against my hip made me physically flinch. It was my mobile phone tucked securely in the pocket of my dark slacks. I stepped into the empty elevator car, and the metal doors slid shut, isolating me once again in a small metal box. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone. The bright screen illuminated the dim space of the elevator. It was a new text message. The sender name flashed boldly across the top of the glass screen. It was my mother. A heavy, cold knot immediately formed in the absolute center of my stomach. My mother never sent text messages during the corporate workday unless there was a massive, uncontainable emergency. I stared at the glowing screen and read the short lines of text. "Come home for dinner immediately tonight. Your sister and I have urgent news to announce." I read the words a second time and then a third time, hoping the letters would somehow rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. The cold knot in my stomach twisted violently. Urgent news to announce. Those words were never followed by anything positive in my family. The fragile foundation of my entire life was already actively collapsing, and now a brand new fault line was opening up at home. My sister was married to Marcus Hayes. Marcus was a ruthless opportunist who constantly viewed my father and his crushing medical debt as a massive financial burden on the family estate. He had been aggressively pressuring my mother for months to remove my father from the expensive clinical trials. He wanted to transfer him to a cheap state-run facility so he could liquidate the remaining family assets to fund his own failing business ventures. If Marcus had somehow convinced my sister to call an emergency family dinner, it meant he had finally made his move. It meant he was launching a direct and aggressive attack on my father's medical care, while I was completely drained and utterly defenseless from the corporate slaughter I had just barely survived. I stood perfectly still in the descending elevator, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my phone. The red digital numbers above the door continued to drop rapidly. 10, 9, 8. I had just signed a legally binding document forfeiting my entire career and my masterpiece specifically to protect my father. I had willingly walked into a soundproof room and let Julian Pierce completely destroy my future, just to guarantee the $12,000 a month for the Alzheimer treatment. But as the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, I realized a horrifying and inescapable truth. The trap was not just located at the office. The trap was everywhere. Julian and Vanessa had crushed me from the top, and now Marcus was waiting at home to cut my legs out from underneath me. The conflict was not ending. It was only just beginning. I gripped the phone tightly in my shaking hand and prepared to walk into a brand new hell. The glowing screen of the mobile phone felt like a massive physical weight in my palm. I stared at the text message from my mother, and a profound, suffocating wave of despair washed over my entire body. My legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. I leaned heavily against the cold metal wall of the descending elevator and let my head drop back. The words "urgent news" stared back at me in bright white letters. In my family, those two words were never followed by anything positive. They were a harbinger of absolute disaster. My mother was a quiet woman who actively avoided conflict at all costs. She would endure weeks of silent suffering before ever reaching out to disrupt my schedule during the middle of a Wednesday workday. If she was demanding that I come home immediately, it meant the situation had violently escalated completely beyond her control. My mind immediately raced through a terrifying gauntlet of the worst possible scenarios. I thought about the towering stacks of final notice medical bills sitting on her kitchen counter. I thought about the aggressive and constant psychological pressure from my brother-in-law, Marcus. He had spent the last 6 months systematically manipulating my younger sister, trying to convince her that our father was a completely lost cause and a massive financial drain on their future. He wanted to force my father into a cheap, state-run facility just so he could liquidate the remaining family assets. The sheer despair in my chest deepened rapidly, morphing into a cold and paralyzing dread. I had just walked out of a soundproof executive office where I had legally surrendered my entire career and my masterpiece for the sole purpose of paying for that exact medical treatment. I had let Julian Pierce lock me in a permanent digital cage just to keep the corporate health insurance active. And now the very foundation I had just sacrificed my soul to protect was actively crumbling beneath my feet. A bitter and metallic taste flooded my mouth all over again. I closed my eyes tightly and let my head rest against the freezing steel panel of the elevator. The universe felt like it was executing a perfectly coordinated and flawless attack against my sanity. I had barely survived a brutal corporate execution, only to be immediately summoned to a domestic slaughter. The absolute desperation of my reality settled heavily over my shoulders like a thick lead blanket. I was fighting a war on 2 fronts, and I was completely out of ammunition. The drive from the Boston corporate headquarters to my mother house in the suburbs was a complete and terrifying blur. I navigated the heavy evening traffic on pure mechanical instinct. My hands gripped the cold leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached with a dull and persistent pain, but my mind was entirely disconnected from the physical world. I was trapped in a continuous and repeating loop of my own absolute destruction. I kept seeing the dark blue ink drying on the final page of the non-disclosure agreement. I kept hearing the sharp and mocking clink of the ice against Julian crystal glass in the Human Resources office. I had sold my soul to the devil to keep my father alive, and now I was driving straight into a brand new nightmare. I pulled my car into the cracked concrete driveway of my childhood home. The small house looked incredibly fragile against the darkening evening sky. The warm yellow light spilling from the dining room window usually made me feel safe, but tonight it just looked like a warning beacon. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark cabin of my car for a long moment. I had to compose myself. I could not let my mother or my sister know that I had just lost my entire career and surrendered my masterpiece to a corporate thief. I had to be strong so I could fight whatever financial battle Marcus had prepared for me tonight. I assumed Marcus was going to demand we sell the house to cover the medical debt. I stepped out of the car and walked up the front steps. The wooden porch creaked under my weight with a familiar and comforting sound. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic instantly filled my lungs. It was the exact meal my mother always cooked when she needed to deliver bad news. It was her way of softening a devastating blow before it landed. I heard the low murmur of voices coming from the dining room at the back of the house. I could hear my sister laughing. It was a light and melodic sound that felt completely out of place in the heavy and suffocating atmosphere of my current reality. I hung my dark corporate coat on the brass hook in the narrow hallway. I took a deep breath and forced a calm and neutral expression onto my face. I prepared myself to see Marcus sitting on the sofa looking smug and arrogant. I prepared all the logical arguments I would need to defend my father and his expensive medical treatments. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the warm light. Every single step felt like walking toward a firing squad. I reached the arched doorway and stopped. I stepped into the dining room and my entire body instantly turned to solid stone. My brain completely stopped processing information for a terrifying few seconds. I stood frozen on the edge of the woven carpet, staring at the impossible and horrifying scene unfolding directly in front of me. The wooden dining table was beautifully set with our best porcelain plates and crystal wine glasses. My mother was sitting on the left side, holding a serving spoon, with a nervous but polite smile on her face. My sister was sitting across from her, leaning forward and listening intently to the conversation. and sitting at the absolute head of the table was Julian Pierce. I was sitting in my father chair. It was the heavy carved wooden chair that had belonged to my father for 30 years. It was the seat of the protector and the provider. It was the exact place my father used to sit before the Alzheimer's disease stole his beautiful mind and forced him into a sterile hospital room. And now Julian was sitting there occupying that sacred space like an invading king who had just conquered a ruined and defenseless castle. He had removed his expensive navy suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. He looked entirely comfortable and relaxed in my home. He was holding a glass of expensive red wine in his right hand. He was smiling. It was the exact same dark and victorious smile he had given me in the Human Resources office just a few hours ago. My mother looked up and saw me standing perfectly still in the doorway. "Chloe, darling, you are finally here," she said. Her voice was bright, but there was a deep current of anxiety running underneath her carefully chosen words. "Please come in and sit down. We have a very special guest joining us for dinner tonight." I could not move a single muscle. I could not pull a single breath of air into my lungs. The walls of the small dining room began to spin violently around me. I felt the exact same suffocating panic that had crushed me in the soundproof executive office earlier today. How was this possible? How did the monster who had just stolen my algorithm and threatened me with federal prison manage to infiltrate my childhood home? The corporate trap and the domestic trap were not two separate events. They were the exact same trap. Julian had not just destroyed my professional life, he had followed me into my absolute safest sanctuary. Julian turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were cold and calculating beneath his charming and handsome facade. "Chloe," he said smoothly. His voice was rich and warm and completely fake. "It is so wonderful to see you outside of the office. Your mother was just telling me all about your childhood. She makes an absolutely incredible roasted chicken." I stared at him with pure, unadulterated horror. He raised his wineglass slightly in a silent and mocking toast. He was showing me the true extent of his limitless power. He wanted me to understand that there was absolutely nowhere I could hide from him. If I tried to fight him at the office, he would destroy my career and send me to federal prison. And if I tried to retreat to my family, he would simply buy his way into my home and sit at my dining table. He was occupying my father chair just to prove that he now controlled every single aspect of my existence. He controlled the algorithm. He controlled the medical insurance. He controlled the clinical trial. And now he was sitting in my house drinking my family wine. My sister smiled brightly and gestured to the empty chair next to her. "Come sit down, Chloe," she said, completely oblivious to the massive psychological warfare happening right in front of her eyes. Julian was just explaining his new investment strategy for the family estate. He has some really amazing ideas to help us manage the medical debt and pay for the clinical trial. The blood roared in my ears like a massive ocean wave crashing against a cliff. I looked at the empty chair they had saved for me. It was positioned directly to the right of Julian. They wanted me to sit beside him like a loyal and obedient servant, just like I was supposed to do at the Wall Street investor presentation on Friday morning. The absolute sheer cruelty of his calculated plan was breathtaking. He had bypassed Marcus entirely and went straight to the matriarch of the family. He had presented himself as the wealthy and benevolent corporate savior willing to rescue a drowning family from their crushing medical debt. He was buying their loyalty and using it to build an inescapable prison around me. I was completely surrounded in my own home. I stood perfectly still in the arched doorway staring at Julian. The air in the dining room felt heavier than lead. Before I could even attempt to form a coherent sentence, a loud and booming voice echoed from the hallway behind me. "Look who finally decided to join the family dinner." I turned my head slightly. Marcus stepped into the warm light of the dining room. My brother-in-law looked like he had just walked off the cover of a luxury financial magazine. He was a tall and incredibly imposing black man who always carried himself with an overwhelming sense of unearned arrogance. Tonight he was wearing a flawless charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly salary. He raised his left hand to adjust his expensive silk tie, and the dining room lights caught the heavy gleam of a brand new solid gold Rolex on his wrist. He was practically vibrating with smug and greedy satisfaction. Marcus walked past me and stood directly behind Julian, resting a heavy hand on the back of my father wooden chair. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear his hand away from the wood. but I was completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of the situation. "Chloe, I want you to officially meet my newest business partner," Marcus announced. His voice echoed loudly in the small room. "I know you two work at the same biotechnology firm, but tonight Julian is here as my personal guest." He grinned and patted Julian on the shoulder. Julian just took another slow sip of his expensive red wine. His dark eyes were locked entirely on my face, watching me drown in real time. I stared at Marcus. My vocal cords felt completely severed. "You invited him here," I whispered. The words barely made it past my lips. "Of course I invited him." Marcus laughed loudly, completely oblivious to the sheer terror radiating from my body. "We have been in aggressive negotiations all week, and I am incredibly proud to announce that Julian has officially agreed to be the lead anchor investor in my new commercial real estate fund. He is committing $5 million in seed capital to back my vision. $5 million. The number dropped into the middle of the dining room like a massive concrete block. My sister beamed with pride and clapped her hands together. My mother offered a polite and relieved smile, clearly believing that this massive influx of wealth was going to somehow save our family from the crushing medical debt. But I knew the horrifying and lethal truth. I looked from the heavy gold Rolex on Marcus' wrist to the dark and victorious smile on Julian's face. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Julian was not just investing in a random real estate fund. He was systematically buying my family. He knew that Marcus was desperate for capital and eager to liquidate our assets. By handing Marcus $5 million, Julian was purchasing absolute loyalty and unquestioned control over the entire household. Julian had effectively weaponized my own brother-in-law against me. Marcus would now do absolutely anything Julian wanted. If Julian commanded Marcus to cut off my father's medical treatments to save money, Marcus would do it in a heartbeat just to keep his wealthy corporate investor happy. They had built an ironclad and inescapable cage around me. They had trapped me at the office with the non-disclosure agreement and the federal prison threats. And now they had trapped me at home using a massive financial bribe disguised as a real estate investment. I was completely surrounded by enemies, and the worst part was that my own family was thanking the monster who was destroying my life. Julian slowly lowered his wine glass to the table. He looked at me with an expression of pure, limitless power. He did not have to say a single word. His presence in my father chair said everything. He owned my algorithm this morning, and he owned my family tonight. I pulled out the heavy wooden dining chair next to my sister and slowly sat down. It was the only empty seat left at the entire table, and it positioned me directly to the right of Julian. The physical proximity to him was absolutely paralyzing. I could smell his expensive masculine cologne mixing heavily with the warm scent of the roasted garlic, and it made my empty stomach violently churn. My mother began passing the heavy porcelain serving plates around the table with a frantic and joyous energy. She was smiling so widely that the familiar exhaustion lines around her eyes seemed to temporarily vanish. She handed a large steaming platter of roasted chicken directly to Julian first. She was treating him like absolute royalty. She was graciously serving the exact monster who had just handed me a corporate death sentence only a few hours ago. I stared down at my empty white ceramic plate. I knew I had to eat something, or they would immediately start asking invasive questions. But the absolute thought of swallowing any food made my throat completely close up. Julian graciously accepted the heavy platter and served himself a generous portion. He acted with such perfect and terrifying charm. He complimented my mother on the beautiful table setting and the incredible aroma of the food. He told her the house had a wonderful and warm energy that he rarely experienced in the wealthy corporate world. Every single word out of his mouth was a meticulously calculated lie designed to secure their absolute blind trust. He was actively building an impenetrable fortress around me, using my own blood relatives as the bricks. Harper leaned forward across the wooden table. Her eyes were absolutely shining with genuine admiration. She looked at Julian as if he were a mythical savior who had just descended from the sky to rescue our broken family. "Marcus has been telling us all about your incredible background, Julian," she said. Her voice was bright and full of innocent awe. "He told us you are the lead visionary behind the massive new artificial intelligence model at the biotechnology firm. He called you an absolute tech genius." I gripped my heavy silver fork beneath the table so tightly that my fingers immediately cramped. I stared blankly down at the white ceramic plate, hoping the sheer force of my anger would not cause me to physically explode. He was not a tech genius. He could not even write a basic algorithmic loop to save his own life. He did not understand the complex mathematical architecture of Project Sentinel or the deep neural pathways I had spent the last 6 months painstakingly building. He was a corporate parasite who systematically stole the brilliance of his subordinates and presented it to the Wall Street investors as his own personal triumph. But I could not say a single word to correct her. The non-disclosure agreement I had signed in the soundproof Human Resources office was a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. Julian offered my sister a humble and perfectly practiced smile. "You are far too kind, Harper," he said smoothly, putting down his silver knife. "I am just a man who understands the future of medical data. Project Sentinel is going to completely revolutionize how we predict clinical outcomes for severe neurological diseases. It has been a massive and exhausting undertaking, but seeing my vision finally come to life has been the greatest achievement of my entire career." The sheer audacity of his lie felt like a physical hunting knife twisting violently between my ribs. He was sitting at my family dining table claiming absolute ownership of my agonizing late-night coding sessions. He was actively taking credit for the complex predictive models I had built from scratch while sitting alone in my narrow, unheated cubicle, and my sister was looking at him with absolute total reverence. "It is just so incredibly inspiring," Harper continued, completely oblivious to the silent psychological torture happening right next to her. "Chloe is so incredibly lucky to work under someone with your level of visionary talent. We are always telling her she needs to find a strong and capable mentor to help her climb the corporate ladder and stop being so invisible." I swallowed a massive lump of pure burning rage. The metallic taste of blood from my bitten lip returned to my mouth. My own sister was actively thanking the man who had just forcefully demoted me to a silent and obedient technical assistant. She was openly celebrating the ruthless thief who had just threatened me with 20 years in a federal prison if I ever dared to speak the truth about my own intellectual property. My mother reached out across the table and gently touched Julian on the forearm. Her eyes were suddenly bright with unshed tears. "You really are a true benefactor to this family, Julian," she said. Her voice trembled with deep and profound gratitude that made my heart physically ache. "When Marcus came home and told us that you were officially investing $5 million into his commercial real estate fund, I practically broke down and cried right in the kitchen. You have absolutely no idea what this level of immense financial security means for us right now." Julian placed his large hand warmly over hers. His dark eyes were perfectly arranged into a flawless mask of deep human sympathy. "Family is the absolute most important thing we have in this world," he said softly. "I know you have all been carrying a very heavy and unfair burden lately. Marcus explained the tragic situation with your husband and those incredibly expensive clinical trials. I just wanted to provide a solid financial foundation so you can finally stop worrying and focus on what truly matters." The absolute hypocrisy of his statement made the small dining room spin violently around me. The walls felt like they were rapidly closing in, just like they had in the Human Resources office. He was sitting in my father's sacred chair, playing the role of the benevolent and wealthy savior, while secretly holding my father's medical treatments completely hostage. He was the exact man who had threatened to terminate my corporate health insurance if I did not legally sign away my masterpiece. He was the one who had weaponized my father's rapidly deteriorating mind to force my total and absolute professional surrender. And now my mother was looking at him with tears of absolute joy, believing he was rescuing us from the very destruction he had personally orchestrated. "It is $12,000 every single month," my mother continued, wiping a stray tear from her wrinkled cheek. "The medical debt was completely crushing us and destroying our hope. We were terrified we were going to have to pull him out of the experimental program by the end of the year. But with your massive financial investment in Marcus' new business, we finally have room to breathe again. We can keep him in the trial where he belongs. You are literally saving his life, Julian. You are our absolute guardian angel." I felt a sudden and violent urge to stand up and flip the heavy wooden table backward. I wanted to shatter the expensive crystal wine glasses against the wall and scream the absolute horrifying truth until my vocal cords physically tore. I wanted to violently shake my mother and tell her that her precious guardian angel was a ruthless corporate predator who had just blackmailed her oldest daughter into total professional slavery. But the terrifying threat of the fabricated FBI audit report echoed loudly in my mind, paralyzing my muscles. If I spoke the truth right now, I would go straight to federal prison. The medical insurance would instantly terminate. The clinical trial would end tomorrow morning. My father would completely lose his memories and eventually die in a state-funded facility. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He was forcing me to sit there silently and listen to my own family worship my absolute abuser. Marcus leaned back heavily in his chair and took a massive bite of the roasted chicken. He chewed loudly and swallowed with a deeply satisfied sigh that echoed in the quiet room. "This is just the very beginning," he announced loudly, puffing out his chest. His heavy gold Rolex flashed violently under the warm dining room lights as he gestured broadly with his fork. "With Julian officially backing my vision, we are going to completely dominate the Boston commercial real estate market. We are going to build an absolute massive empire together. And we are going to make sure this entire family never has to worry about a single hospital bill ever again." Julian picked up his crystal wine glass and held it gracefully up in the air. "To the future," he said smoothly, "and to making the absolute right choices when the pressure is at its absolute highest." He turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. His dark eyes were completely dead and devoid of any human empathy whatsoever. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a great white shark circling a bleeding and helpless victim in open water. "Do you agree with that, Chloe?" he asked. His voice was soft and perfectly polite, but the lethal warning buried underneath the words was unmistakable. He was daring me to challenge his authority in front of the audience he had just purchased. "Do you agree that making the right choice under extreme pressure is the absolute key to a successful future?" Julian asked again, letting the question hang heavily in the air. The entire dining table suddenly went completely quiet. My mother, my sister, and Marcus all stopped eating and turned their heads to look directly at me. They were eagerly waiting for me to validate the brilliant tech genius sitting at the head of the table. They were waiting for me to express my deep and profound gratitude to the wealthy benefactor who was single-handedly saving our family from absolute ruin. The tense silence dragged on for a terrifying and agonizing eternity. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs, feeling like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. I looked at the dark red wine swirling lazily in his crystal glass. I looked at the smug and incredibly arrogant smile resting on his face. He wanted me to verbally submit to him in front of my own family. He wanted me to actively choke on my own absolute and total defeat. I forced my paralyzed vocal cords to work. The words tasted exactly like bitter poison on my tongue. "I agree," I whispered. My voice sounded incredibly hollow and completely broken. It did not even sound like my own voice anymore. Making the right choice is everything I said, staring directly into his dead eyes. Julian smiled broadly and took a slow, victorious sip of his expensive red wine. He had completely won. He had effortlessly conquered my office this morning, and now he had completely conquered my home tonight. The psychological torture was absolute, and there was absolutely no escape from the trap. I was completely buried alive under the crushing and suffocating weight of my own family, blind and misplaced gratitude. The dinner plates were finally cleared away, but the suffocating tension in the room only grew heavier. Julian leaned back in my father chair, looking incredibly satisfied with the psychological destruction he had orchestrated. Harper let out a sudden and dramatic sigh that completely shattered the brief silence in the dining room. She reached for her crystal wine glass with a perfectly manicured hand that trembled just enough to draw everyone's attention. "The wedding planner in Italy sent me the revised budget this afternoon," Harper announced. Her voice wavered with an expertly crafted layer of distress. "The costs for the venue in Capri have completely skyrocketed over the last few months. The local vendors are doubling their prices for the floral arrangements, and the yacht rental for the reception is suddenly 20% more expensive than they originally quoted us." I stared at my sister in absolute disbelief. Our father was dying in a hospital bed a few miles away. The family was allegedly drowning in a massive ocean of medical debt. Yet they were still aggressively pushing forward with a lavish destination wedding on an exclusive Italian island. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair and adjusted his heavy gold Rolex. "You know all my liquid capital is completely tied up right now, baby," he said smoothly. He glanced quickly at Julian to ensure his new wealthy investor was listening. "Every single dollar I have is locked into the new commercial real estate fund. The $5 million Julian invested is strictly regulated for property acquisitions. We cannot touch a single penny of it for personal expenses. It is a major compliance issue." Julian nodded solemnly, offering absolute validation to Marcus' completely fabricated excuse. "That is absolutely correct," Julian added, his voice dripping with fake professional integrity. "The investment capital must remain entirely segregated to protect the integrity of the real estate portfolio." My mother folded her napkin neatly and placed it softly on the wooden table. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide and pleading, but there was a hard and demanding edge buried deep beneath her maternal facade. "Chloe, darling, we are really counting on you to help step up for your sister," my mother said. Her voice was incredibly soft, but it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "We are all making massive sacrifices right now to keep this family afloat. Marcus is working so hard to build a future for us, and Julian has generously secured the medical treatments for your father. But Harper deserves to have her dream wedding. She has been under so much stress lately." I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I could not comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I whispered. My mother reached across the table and tried to grab my hand, but I pulled it away instinctively. "We know you have been contributing to your corporate retirement account since you started working at the biotechnology firm." She continued smoothly, completely ignoring my physical withdrawal. "You have a very healthy 401k plan. We spoke to a financial advisor yesterday. If you make an emergency hardship withdrawal right now, you can easily pull out $40,000 to cover the remaining costs for the Capri wedding." $40,000. The number echoed in my head like a deafening siren. The absolute sheer insanity of the request completely paralyzed my vocal cords. They were demanding that I completely liquidate my entire life savings. They wanted me to drain the only financial security I had left in the world to pay for imported Italian flowers and a luxury yacht rental. I was already sacrificing my entire career, my masterpiece, and my dignity just to pay $12,000 a month for the Alzheimer clinical trials. And now they wanted my retirement fund too. "You want me to empty my retirement account for a wedding?" I asked. My voice sounded incredibly foreign to my own ears. It was a hollow and vibrating whisper. "If I withdraw that money early, I will be hit with massive financial penalties and brutal taxes. It will completely wipe out everything I have saved for the last 10 years. "It is just a temporary loan," Chloe Marcus interrupted aggressively. He leaned heavily across the table, invading my physical space. "As soon as the real estate fund turns a profit next year, I will pay you back every single cent with interest. You just need to front the cash right now to secure the Italian vendors. It is what families do for each other. We support each other in times of crisis." "A crisis," I repeated blankly, staring at the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist. "You are wearing a brand new solid gold Rolex, Marcus. If you are so desperate for liquid cash, why do you not sell the watch to pay for the yacht?" Marcus slammed his hand down flat on the wooden table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. "The heavy gold watch is a necessary business expense," he snapped, his voice raising in sudden anger. "I have to project massive wealth and success when I am meeting with high-level investors. It is an incredibly vital part of my corporate image. You would not understand that because you just hide in a tiny cubicle staring at a computer screen all day." I felt a massive surge of pure burning rage ignite deep in my chest. I looked over at Julian, expecting him to finally stay out of the family conflict. But Julian simply smiled and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the dining table. "Actually, Chloe," Julian said, his dark eyes completely locked onto mine, "Marcus makes a very valid point. At Origin, we pride ourselves on taking exceptional care of our employees. Your compensation package and your retirement matching program are incredibly generous. Withdrawing a mere $40,000 is a very small price to pay to ensure your sister absolute happiness, especially since you have such a stable and secure position as my technical assistant." The absolute cruelty of his intervention was breathtaking. He was publicly reminding me of my forced demotion right in front of my family. He was locking me into the trap and throwing away the key. If I refused to give them the money, I would look like a selfish and terrible sister hoarding wealth while the rest of the family allegedly struggled. My mother would cry, Marcus would rage, and Julian would sit there and watch me become the absolute villain in my own home. "Chloe, please," my mother begged. Her eyes were filling with massive crocodile tears. "Do not be so selfish right now. Julian just handed this family a miracle today. He saved your father's life. The absolute least you can do is make a small financial sacrifice, so your sister does not have to cancel the most important day of her entire life. We are a family. We are supposed to share the burden." The suffocating claustrophobia reached its absolute breaking point. There was no burden sharing happening here. I was the only one carrying the crushing weight of the entire world. They did not view me as a daughter or a sister or a human being. They viewed me as a limitless automated teller machine. They were vampires actively draining every single drop of my blood while publicly praising a corporate thief who had just slit my throat. I was entirely alone at a table full of monsters. I slammed both of my hands flat onto the heavy wooden table. The sudden impact made the crystal wine glasses shake violently and the silver forks clatter loudly against the porcelain plates. I could not hold the burning rage inside my body for a single second longer. The suffocating pressure finally shattered my professional composure completely. "I am not giving you my retirement money," I screamed. My voice tore through the quiet dining room like a physical weapon, completely shattering their polite domestic illusion. "Do you have absolutely any idea what is actually happening in the real world? I am paying $12,000 every single month just to keep our father alive. I am the absolute only reason his clinical trials have not been permanently terminated. I am sacrificing every single aspect of my life and bleeding myself entirely dry to pay his medical bills while you sit here demanding my life savings for a luxury yacht in Italy." The dining room went dead silent. My mother gasped and pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. My sister looked away, completely unable to meet my furious gaze. But Marcus did not flinch. He did not look even slightly ashamed of his outrageous greed. Instead, a slow and incredibly condescending smirk spread across his face. He leaned back casually in his wooden chair and adjusted the cuffs of his expensive Tom Ford suit, letting the heavy gold Rolex catch the overhead light one more time. He looked at me with the absolute mocking pity of a highly successful man staring down at a total failure. "That is just because you are completely incompetent," Chloe Marcus said coldly. He let out a short, arrogant laugh that echoed terribly in the small room. His voice was dripping with heavy arrogance and absolute superiority. "You are constantly struggling with money because you have absolutely zero ambition and zero talent. You have been stuck in the exact same junior position for years. Just look at Julian sitting right next to you." Marcus gestured proudly toward the head of the table. "Julian is about to be promoted to senior vice president because he had the absolute visionary brilliance to build Project Sentinel. He is completely revolutionizing the medical tech industry, and he is getting incredibly wealthy doing it. You work in the exact same analytics department as this absolute genius, but you are nothing more than his glorified errand girl. You fetch his coffee and format his spreadsheets while he actually changes the world. Do not blame us because you are terrible at your job." The words hit me with the kinetic force of a speeding freight train. I stopped breathing entirely. The oxygen was violently sucked right out of the dining room. I felt completely paralyzed as the true horror of his statement washed over my brain. My own brother-in-law was actively weaponizing my stolen masterpiece against me. He was loudly praising Julian for stealing the exact artificial intelligence algorithm that I had spent 6 months agonizingly building from scratch. He was calling me an incompetent lackey in my own childhood home, simply because Julian had legally blackmailed me into that exact subservient position just a few hours ago. I turned my head slowly and looked at Julian. He was sitting perfectly relaxed in my father's sacred chair. He did not say a single word to correct the record. He did not intervene. He simply held his crystal glass of expensive red wine and watched my own family completely destroy my dignity on his behalf. The psychological torture was an absolute masterpiece. He had stolen my brilliant code at the corporate office, and now he was letting my own family use my stolen success to verbally beat me into absolute submission. There was no escape. The trap was flawless. The silence in the dining room was completely deafening. Marcus looked incredibly smug while my mother and sister watched me with expressions of deep and profound disappointment. Just as I felt my entire reality begin to fracture under the crushing weight of their betrayal, Julian slowly raised his left hand. The simple and quiet gesture instantly commanded the absolute attention of the entire table. He placed his crystal wine glass down on the wooden surface and offered a gentle and incredibly forgiving smile. "Marcus, there is absolutely no need for such hostility tonight," Julian said. His voice was smooth and coated in a sickening layer of manufactured grace. "Chloe is under an immense amount of pressure right now. Severe medical debt can easily cloud a person's judgment and make them incredibly defensive. We need to approach this delicate family situation with empathy and compassion." He turned his head and looked directly at me. His dark eyes were completely void of any actual human warmth. They were the cold, unblinking eyes of a predator who had just successfully cornered his prey in a dead-end alley. "I absolutely cannot stand to see a beautiful family fighting over simple finances." Julian continued, acting as if his heart was genuinely breaking for our domestic struggle. "Harper absolutely deserves to have her perfect dream wedding in Italy. And Chloe, you absolutely need to protect your retirement fund for your own future security. So I am going to solve this temporary problem for everyone right now." My mother let out a small, confused gasp. Julian reached gracefully into the inside pocket of his expensive navy suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. "I am going to personally loan you the $40,000, Chloe," Julian announced smoothly. "I will write the check right now and hand it directly to Harper to cover the Italian vendors and the yacht rental. You do not have to drain your corporate retirement account, and your family does not have to stress about the upcoming deadlines." My sister let out a loud squeal of absolute joy. My mother immediately burst into fresh tears of profound gratitude, pressing her hands against her heart. Marcus nodded his head with deep respect, as if he were witnessing a literal religious miracle happen right inside our home. But the blood in my veins turned to absolute solid ice. I knew exactly what he was doing. Julian Pierce never gave a single thing away for free. Every single dollar he spent was a weapon designed to buy control. Julian picked up his silver fountain pen and began to casually write out the massive check right on my family dining table. "Of course, a personal financial favor of this incredible magnitude requires a firm guarantee of loyalty," he said softly. The metal tip of his pen scratched loudly against the paper in the quiet room. "I consider this a permanent investment in your career, Chloe. I am going to need you to remain precisely where you are as my dedicated technical assistant for a very long time." He looked up from the checkbook and locked his dead eyes onto mine. "I need your absolute, unquestioned dedication to my corporate vision." Julian stated the threat ringing loud and clear beneath his polite words. "I need you to promise me that you will never try to leave my department or step out of the shadows. If you remain a loyal and perfectly obedient assistant by my side, I will eventually forgive the entire debt. But if you ever try to break our special arrangement or challenge my authority, I will immediately call in the loan and demand the $40,000 back in full." He tore the crisp check from the leather booklet and slid it across the heavy wooden table toward my sister. Harper snatched it up instantly, treating the small piece of paper like a winning lottery ticket. My mother leaned over and kissed Julian on the cheek, completely oblivious to the horrific hostage negotiation that had just taken place right in front of her eyes. I stared at Julian, completely paralyzed and unable to speak. The psychological execution was an absolute masterpiece. By offering this loan, he had effectively bypassed the non-disclosure agreement entirely and created a brand new financial prison. If I tried to expose his theft on Friday morning, he would not just send me to federal prison. He would immediately demand the $40,000 from my sister, bankrupting my entire family and destroying her wedding in one single move. He was actively buying my permanent submission. He was legally ensuring that I would spend the rest of my entire professional life fetching his coffee, formatting his slides, and silently watching him take absolute credit for my genius. And the absolute worst part was that my own family was actively cheering and celebrating as he locked the heavy iron collar directly around my neck. I stared at the $40,000 check resting in my sister's hand. I looked at my mother, wiping tears of absolute joy from her cheeks. And then I looked at Julian. He was sitting in my father chair holding his crystal wine glass, wearing that exact same victorious and completely empty smile. The sheer gravity of his absolute manipulation finally crushed whatever tiny shred of domestic compliance I had left in my body. I stood up so fast that my heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. My right arm swung outward in a massive and uncontrolled arc. My hand slammed directly into Julian's crystal wine glass. The expensive glass tipped backward and shattered completely against the heavy porcelain serving platter. A massive wave of dark red wine exploded across the white linen tablecloth. It looked exactly like fresh blood rapidly soaking into the pristine white fabric. My mother screamed. Harper jumped back from the table, clutching the loan check to her chest as if I were about to physically attack her. Julian did not even flinch. He simply looked down at the dark red stain spreading across the table and then looked back up at me with absolute bored amusement. I did not apologize. I did not say a single word. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the dining room. I moved blindly through the narrow hallway. I grabbed my dark corporate coat from the brass hook near the front door. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the heavy brass doorknob. I yanked the front door open and practically threw myself out into the freezing night air. The cold wind hit my face like a physical slap, bringing a tiny fraction of clarity back to my completely chaotic mind. I stumbled down the wooden porch steps and practically ran across the cracked concrete driveway toward my car. The absolute heavy darkness of the suburban street offered a temporary visual relief from the bright and suffocating lights of my childhood home. I reached the driver's side door of my car and pulled my keys from my pocket. Before I could even unlock the door, I heard the heavy and aggressive sound of leather dress shoes slamming against the concrete directly behind me. I did not have to turn around to know exactly who had followed me into the dark. I froze with my hand on the cold metal door handle. Marcus stopped less than 2 feet behind me. His heavy breathing was loud and entirely deliberate. He was using his massive physical size to actively intimidate me in the pitch-black driveway. He smelled heavily of expensive cologne and roasted garlic. "You are an absolute mess," Chloe Marcus said. His voice was completely stripped of the fake and polite family charm he had been projecting all evening. It was cold, harsh, and dripping with pure, naked greed. "You just threw a massive childish tantrum in front of the man who is single-handedly saving this entire family from total bankruptcy." I slowly turned around and pressed my back firmly against the cold metal of my car door. Marcus was standing incredibly close. The street lamp at the end of the road cast long and distorted shadows across his face, making him look like a complete stranger. "Do not ever pretend that you care about saving this family," I whispered, my voice shaking with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You do not care about my father. You do not care about the medical bills. You only care about the $5 million Julian is handing you for your fake real estate fund. You are selling my entire life to a corporate thief just so you can wear a brand new solid gold watch." Marcus let out a short and incredibly cruel laugh. He took one step closer, trapping me entirely against the side of the vehicle. "You really think you are the victim here?" he sneered, leaning down so his face was entirely level with mine. "You think you are the brilliant martyr carrying the weight of the world on your tiny shoulders. Let me explain exactly how the real world operates. Wealth and power are the only things that actually matter. Julian has both. You have neither. You are a completely replaceable technical assistant who just got incredibly lucky to ride the coattails of a real visionary. Julian is handing me $5 million to build an empire. He is handing your sister a dream wedding. And he is graciously allowing your father to stay in that incredibly expensive hospital bed. All you have to do is sit down, shut your mouth, and format his spreadsheets." He raised his right hand and pointed a massive finger directly at my face. "Do not ever try to sabotage my investment," Marcus whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal and terrifying register. "If you do anything to upset Julian, if you throw another tantrum at the office, if you jeopardize my $5 million in any way whatsoever, I will personally make sure your father is thrown out of that clinical trial the very next morning. I am the legal proxy on his estate now. Your mother signed the papers last week. I have the absolute power to terminate his medical care with a single phone call. I will pull the plug on his treatment, and I will gladly watch him forget his own name if it means protecting my financial future." The cold night air suddenly felt like it had entirely frozen in my lungs. My mother had signed over the medical proxy. She had given Marcus absolute legal control over my father's healthcare decisions. The trap was not just flawless, it was completely absolute. Julian owned my career, and Marcus owned my father life. They were two massive predators who had joined forces to completely consume my entire existence. Marcus stared at me for a long, terrifying moment, ensuring his threat had successfully paralyzed me. Then he simply turned his back and walked slowly away, returning to the warm and brightly lit house where my family was eagerly waiting to celebrate his absolute victory. I stood completely alone in the freezing dark, pressing my hands against the cold metal of my car. I was broken. I was legally and financially completely destroyed. But deep inside the absolute darkest corner of my mind, the complex mathematical logic of the Sentinel algorithm began to quietly calculate a brand new path. I heard the heavy sound of leather dress shoes aggressively striking the cold concrete of the driveway right behind me. For one brief and incredibly pathetic second, I actually thought Marcus had come out to check on me. I thought my own brother-in-law was going to offer a single shred of genuine human sympathy after witnessing that absolute psychological slaughter in the dining room. I stopped digging through my coat pocket for my car keys and slowly turned around. But there was absolutely no comfort waiting for me in the freezing dark. As I reached for the cold metal of the handle, Marcus suddenly lunged forward. He slammed his massive hand flat against the car door, violently pinning it shut. The loud metallic bang echoed down the quiet suburban street. He stepped directly into my personal space, using his large physical frame to completely trap me between his body and the side of the vehicle. The street lamp at the corner cast a harsh shadow across his face, stripping away all of his polite domestic charm and revealing the ruthless opportunist hiding underneath. "Listen to me very carefully," Chloe Marcus growled. His voice was a low and vibrating threat that made the cold air feel even heavier. "Julian is getting ready to pour $5 million of pure liquid capital directly into my commercial real estate fund. That is absolute generational wealth. That is the empire I have been building toward my entire life, and I am not going to let a weak and hysterical loser like you jeopardize my future." I pressed my back hard against the freezing car window, trying to put even an inch of space between us. I could smell the expensive red wine and the heavy roasted garlic on his breath. "If you go back to that corporate office and do absolutely anything to ruin my relationship with Julian, I will personally destroy your entire life," Marcus whispered, leaning his face mere inches from mine. "If you throw another childish tantrum at the biotechnology firm, or if you try to sabotage his promotion in any way whatsoever, I will make sure you have absolutely nothing left in this world." He dug his heavy fingers into the shoulder of my coat, pressing me harder against the metal door. "You think you are so smart and so essential to this family," he continued, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "But if you cross Julian, I will sit down with your mother tomorrow morning. I will tell her that you are completely unstable and financially reckless. I will easily convince her that the absolute only way to pay off the remaining medical debt is to immediately sell this heavily mortgaged house." My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The house was the absolute last safe harbor we had left. "She listens to every single word I say now." Marcus smiled coldly, completely enjoying the sheer terror spreading across my face. "I am the successful financial expert in this family. You are just the pathetic assistant. I will make sure she legally liquidates this property, and I will personally stand on the front lawn and watch them throw you and your cheap belongings directly onto the street. You will be completely homeless, Chloe. You will have no job, no money, and no family." He let go of my coat and took a single step back, easily slipping his hands into the pockets of his expensive suit trousers. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. "So you are going to walk back into that office on Friday morning, and you are going to be the best little technical assistant Julian Pierce has ever had," Marcus commanded smoothly. "You are going to smile, and you are going to do exactly what you are told, because if you do not, I will completely erase you from this family." He did not wait for my response. He simply turned his back and walked casually up the concrete driveway toward the warm and brightly lit house. He walked back inside to join the mother who worshipped him and the sister who blindly adored him, leaving me completely paralyzed in the freezing dark. The trap was absolutely perfect. Julian had completely chained me to my desk at work, and now Marcus had firmly locked the iron collar around my neck at home. There was nowhere left to run. I stared at the heavy hand pinning my car door shut. The freezing night air suddenly felt completely still. Marcus was waiting for me to break down. He was waiting for the familiar tears of total defeat. But the tears did not come. The crushing weight of the absolute betrayal finally reached its maximum physical capacity, and then it simply shattered. All the suffocating panic and the crippling fear that had been paralyzing me for the last 24 hours instantly evaporated into the cold, dark air. I raised my right hand and violently shoved Marcus' heavy arm away from the metal frame. He stumbled backward in genuine surprise. His expensive dress shoes scraped loudly against the concrete driveway. Before he could even regain his balance, I grabbed the cold metal handle and slammed the car door entirely shut. The loud explosive sound echoed like a gunshot down the quiet suburban street. Marcus stared at me with wide eyes. The smug arrogance was temporarily wiped completely off his face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked right through him. I looked at him the exact same way I looked at a corrupted line of code on my computer screen. He was no longer my brother-in-law. He was just a malignant variable in a deeply flawed system, and systems could be broken. I had hit absolute rock bottom. There was nowhere left to fall, and that meant there was absolutely nothing left to fear. Julian and Marcus thought they had built the perfect, inescapable prison. They thought they had legally and financially chained me to the floor. But they fundamentally misunderstood exactly who they were dealing with. I was not a corporate secretary. I was not a weak and hysterical victim. I was the master architect of Project Sentinel. I built complex neural networks that could predict human behavior before the humans even knew what they were going to do. I had spent the last 6 months designing an artificial intelligence that could map the human brain. I knew how to find the absolute weakest points in any architecture. Julian thought his non-disclosure agreement was an impenetrable fortress. Marcus thought his legal proxy over my father was an absolute shield. But they were just basic conditional logic. If this, then that. If Chloe speaks, then federal prison. If Chloe rebels, then homelessness. It was a very simple and highly predictable algorithm of domestic terrorism. But every single algorithm has a hidden backdoor if you know exactly where to look. I turned my back on Marcus, completely ignoring whatever empty threats he was trying to stammer out in the freezing dark. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. My hands were no longer shaking. The paralyzing terror had been entirely replaced by a freezing and absolute clarity. The lethal instinct of a senior programmer took total control of my nervous system. Julian wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare. He wanted to steal my masterpiece and use my own family as human shields. But he forgot one incredibly critical detail. I was the one who wrote the original source code. And on Friday morning during the Wall Street investor presentation, I was going to rewrite the entire system and gladly watch his massive empire burn straight to the ground. I drove away from my childhood home, and I did not look back in the rearview mirror a single time. The streetlights flashed rapidly across the windshield, casting long and rhythmic shadows across the dark interior of my car. My heart was no longer racing with blind panic. Instead, it was beating with a slow and incredibly steady rhythm. The suffocating anxiety that had completely paralyzed me in the Human Resources office and at the family dining table was entirely gone. It had burned away completely, leaving behind a cold and brilliant mental clarity. Julian and Marcus had pushed me right up to the absolute edge of a massive cliff, hoping the sheer terror of the drop would force me to surrender. But they forgot that some people do not scream when they are pushed. Some people just learn exactly how to fly in the dark. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, feeling the physical reality of my own power returning to my muscles. I was no longer the helpless victim trapped in their pathetic domestic crossfire. I was the architect. I parked my car in the empty asphalt lot directly behind my apartment building. I walked up the 3 flights of concrete stairs in the pitch-black hallway, listening to the echo of my own quiet footsteps. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside my small and completely silent apartment. I did not bother turning on any of the overhead lights. I did not want the artificial brightness to break my absolute total concentration. I walked straight into the dark living room and sat down heavily at my small wooden desk. My personal laptop was sitting exactly where I had left it this morning. It looked like a simple piece of commercial hardware, but it was actually the only weapon I needed to destroy an entire corporate empire. I opened the heavy metal lid, and the bright white glow of the screen instantly illuminated my face in the dark room. I placed my hands flat on the smooth plastic keyboard, feeling the familiar and comforting texture of the keys beneath my fingertips. This was my absolute domain. This was the one place where Julian Pierce had absolutely zero power over me. I stared at the blinking cursor on the dark screen and let out a soft and cold breath. Julian thought he was an absolute genius. He went to bed tonight firmly believing he had completely checkmated me on every single possible board. He thought the non-disclosure agreement was a flawless legal gag order that would keep my mouth permanently shut. He thought the massive financial loan to my sister was the ultimate psychological chain that would keep me obedient. And most importantly, he thought he had successfully locked me completely out of the Origen corporate network. Right after he forced me to sign those blackmail papers in the soundproof office, he immediately revoked all of my high-level administrative privileges. He ordered the information technology department to instantly change the master server passwords and block my secure credentials from accessing the primary mainframe. He thought he had completely severed my connection to Project Sentinel. He genuinely believed that by simply taking away my official employee badge access, he had successfully stolen my masterpiece forever. It was the absolute arrogant assumption of a pathetic corporate parasite who did not actually understand a single line of the code he was aggressively stealing. Julian was a businessman playing a highly dangerous game with a senior software engineer. He thought a complex neural network was just a simple digital filing cabinet that you could lock with a basic electronic key and walk away. But an artificial intelligence model is a living and breathing digital organism, and I was the one who personally built every single microscopic piece of its digital DNA. I spent 6 grueling months writing that algorithm from the ground up while he was out having expensive martini lunches with the Wall Street investors. You do not build a weapon of that massive magnitude without hiding a spare set of keys securely under the digital welcome mat. From the very first day of coding, I knew the corporate vultures would eventually try to circle my project. I knew someone like Julian would eventually try to swoop in and take absolute credit for my agonizing late-night labor. So I did what any highly intelligent architect would do to protect their own creation. I built an invisible trapdoor directly into the absolute deepest foundational layer of the Project Sentinel source code. I opened a secure encrypted terminal on my personal laptop. The screen shifted to a completely black background with a tiny blinking green cursor waiting patiently for my command. Julian thought he had locked the main gates, but he had absolutely no idea that there was a hidden subterranean tunnel running directly beneath the entire corporate fortress. I began to type rapidly. My fingers flew across the keyboard with absolute lethal precision. I was not using my official Origin employee credentials because those were entirely dead. Instead, I was accessing a highly classified command protocol disguised as a benign background diagnostic program. I had cleverly buried this access point so deep inside the machine learning training data that it looked exactly like a redundant memory loop. No corporate security audit would ever be able to detect it because it was woven directly into the very fabric of the artificial intelligence itself. I typed in the final string of complex encrypted characters, activating the silent ghost protocol I had prepared for this exact nightmare scenario. The terminal paused for one agonizing second as the massive external server verified my absolute secret identity. The silence in my dark apartment was completely absolute. And then the entire screen suddenly exploded with scrolling green text. The data cascaded down the monitor, reflecting in my eyes as I watched the system grant me total, unrestricted access. I had successfully bypassed their massive corporate firewall completely undetected. I was officially back inside the core mainframe. I had absolute root access to the entire Sentinel algorithm, bypassing every single security measure Julian had smugly put in place. Julian Pierce thought he had legally buried me alive today. He thought he had completely won the war. But he was about to find out that he had just locked himself inside a massive digital cage with a highly motivated apex predator, and I was holding the absolute only key. I navigated through the pitch-black terminal screen on my laptop. The scrolling green text reflected brightly in my tired eyes as I effortlessly bypassed the final security firewall. I was completely invisible inside the massive corporate system. My first objective for the night was incredibly simple. I needed absolute proof of my original authorship. I bypassed the main directory entirely and dug straight down into the foundational architecture of the neural network. I pulled up the heavily encrypted creation logs. There it was sitting perfectly untouched in the dark. Thousands of hours of pure keystroke data completely stamped with my personal employee identification number. Every single line of complex code and every single algorithmic structure was permanently burned into the digital history. Julian had ordered the Human Resources Department to legally erase my name from the official project files, but he could not erase the digital footprint of my actual hands building the machine. I initiated a secure file transfer protocol and downloaded the massive log file directly to my personal hard drive. I finally had the absolute proof I needed to destroy his fake corporate narrative. But as the download progress bar slowly reached 100%, I noticed something completely wrong in the active server environment. The Sentinel artificial intelligence was a highly sensitive mathematical ecosystem. I knew every single pathway and every single data node because I had personally designed them from scratch in complete isolation. But as I watched the live data streams rendering on my monitor, I saw a massive structural anomaly pulsing deep inside the primary clinical trial database. It looked exactly like a brutal and clumsy digital scar on a beautiful painting. Someone had forcefully bypassed the standard data entry protocols and manually injected an external command script directly into the predictive modeling core. The code was incredibly sloppy and completely amateur. It was absolutely the desperate work of someone who did not understand the delicate balance of a complex neural network. It was the exact work of a greedy corporate executive trying to force a machine to tell a highly specific lie. My heart began to beat much faster in my chest. I opened a secondary terminal window and began to aggressively trace the unauthorized command script back to its absolute origin point. I followed the digital trail through a complex maze of dummy folders and fake security partitions. Julian had tried to cover his illegal tracks using basic commercial encryption software that a first-year computer science student could easily bypass. He was incredibly arrogant to think his basic corporate security tricks could hide his massive digital footprints from the actual architect of the system. I ripped through his pathetic firewalls in less than 3 minutes without triggering a single alarm. The dark trail led directly to his private executive server node. He had been secretly logging into the mainframe late at night, long after the engineering team had gone home. He was not just stealing my code to get a fancy corporate promotion. I was actively destroying the mathematical integrity of the machine itself. I held my breath and executed a brutal force command to pry open the encrypted folder containing his recent modifications. The screen flashed bright white for a fraction of a second before revealing the absolute horrifying truth. I stared at the raw clinical trial data, scrolling rapidly across my screen, and my blood turned to absolute solid ice. The biotechnology firm was currently testing a highly experimental neurological drug using the Sentinel algorithm to predict patient survival rates. The initial datasets I had processed last month showed a completely unacceptable medical risk profile. But the numbers staring back at me right now were entirely different. Julian had manually inserted a lethal logic bomb directly into the core predictive model. He had intentionally altered the mathematical weights to aggressively suppress adverse patient reactions. He was forcing the artificial intelligence to systematically ignore the absolute worst-case scenarios and delete the failing patients from the simulation entirely. I ran a rapid comparative analysis between his manipulated data and the original raw medical reports. The true results were absolutely devastating. 12% of the human patients in the simulated control group suffered catastrophic neurological failure and died. 12%. It was a massive and completely lethal mortality rate that would instantly shut down any clinical trial in the country. Julian had discovered the deadly failure rate, and instead of halting the clinical trials to protect the human patients, he actively chose to bury the digital bodies deep in the code. He had reprogrammed my beautiful and flawless machine to spit out fake positive results. He turned my life-saving algorithm into a massive digital slaughterhouse. The sheer magnitude of his absolute sociopathic greed completely paralyzed my breathing in the dark room. I dug deeper into his private email server to find the exact reason for this horrific and illegal manipulation. I found the master financial presentation he was preparing for the Wall Street investors on Friday morning. Everything suddenly snapped into perfect and terrifying focus. The massive global investment group was fully prepared to inject $2 billion into Origen, but the entire megadeal was strictly contingent on the guaranteed safety of this exact neurological drug. Marcus had spent the entire evening bragging about a $5 million real estate fund, completely oblivious to the massive $2 billion federal fraud happening right above his head. Julian was not just stealing my intellectual property to climb the corporate ladder. I was orchestrating the deadliest pharmaceutical fraud in modern history. He was going to stand up in that massive glass boardroom on Friday and use my stolen machine to confidently lie to the most powerful financial regulators in the world. He was going to knowingly unleash a highly lethal drug into the public market just to secure his massive vice president promotion and his multi-million-dollar cash bonus. The 12% mortality rate was just acceptable collateral damage to him. Human lives were just an annoying statistical error that he decided to manually delete from the spreadsheet, and he had forced me to legally take the absolute fall. By locking me into the non-disclosure agreement and demanding my absolute silence, he was ensuring that if the federal investigators ever discovered the manipulated data, they would trace the original code straight back to my personal employee profile. He was setting me up to take the entire blame and go to federal prison for the rest of my life. A slow and completely terrifying smile spread across my face in the dark apartment. Julian Pierce thought he was a master manipulator playing a brilliant game of high-stakes corporate chess. But he was just a pathetic amateur playing with highly explosive digital materials he did not even begin to understand. He had completely underestimated the absolute lethal precision of a senior software engineer with absolutely nothing left to lose. I did not just have the proof of his intellectual theft anymore. I now had the absolute undeniable proof of his $2 billion federal crime. I downloaded every single piece of manipulated data, every single fake clinical report, and every single internal email from his private server. I compiled all the massive evidence into a highly encrypted digital package. This was not just a defensive weapon anymore. It was a massive and completely unstoppable digital time bomb. And I was going to wire the detonator directly into the main presentation screen for Friday morning. I was going to gladly watch him step onto that corporate stage and pull the absolute trigger himself. I stared at the downloaded files illuminating the walls of my dark apartment. The absolute gravity of what I was looking at began to physically crush the air right out of my lungs. This was no longer just a pathetic case of corporate intellectual property theft or a toxic workplace dispute. The data glowing on my monitor represented a massive and deliberate federal crime. Julian was not just stealing a complex artificial intelligence algorithm. He was actively committing severe and undeniable violations against the Food and Drug Administration. By deliberately hiding a 12% mortality rate in a live clinical trial, he was knowingly preparing to release a highly toxic and lethal drug into the global medical market. He was actively signing the death warrants for thousands of innocent and desperate patients just to hit his quarterly corporate targets. I was willing to let people die in absolute agony so he could secure his promotion to senior vice president. And he was combining this massive medical cover-up with a $2 billion financial fraud designed to completely deceive the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was planning to stand in that massive glass boardroom and lie directly to the faces of federal regulators and global investors. He was going to use my stolen machine to convince the most powerful financial institutions in the world to heavily invest in a product that was mathematically guaranteed to kill people. If Julian successfully executed this Wall Street presentation on Friday morning, it would instantly become one of the largest and most destructive corporate crimes in modern history. And he was so incredibly arrogant that he genuinely thought he could just sweep a 12% human body count completely under the digital rug. My hands rested completely still on the smooth plastic keyboard. The sheer scale of his sociopathic behavior was absolutely breathtaking. He had weaponized Marcus to financially control my family, and he had leveraged my father's rapidly deteriorating brain to legally force my professional silence. He genuinely believed that those pathetic domestic traps would successfully protect his massive federal fraud. He thought chaining me to a desk as his completely obedient technical assistant would guarantee that the federal regulators would never ever see the raw and unedited clinical data. But as I looked at the heavily encrypted files, a brand new layer of absolute horror washed over me. I finally understood his ultimate backup plan. If the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Food and Drug Administration ever decided to aggressively audit the Sentinel project, the modified digital trail would lead straight back to my personal employee identification number. Julian was not just buying my silence. He was meticulously setting me up to take the absolute full impact of a massive federal indictment. If the bodies ever started dropping in the real world, he was planning to hand me directly over to the authorities as a rogue and unstable engineer. He was planning to send me to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of my natural life, while he escaped with his massive cash bonus on a private corporate jet. A cold and bitter laugh completely escaped my throat, echoing loudly in the silent living room. Julian had built a brilliant and seemingly flawless trap. He had completely surrounded me with enemies at the office and inside my own home. But he made one single fatal error in his grand architectural design. He handed the absolute most dangerous weapon in the entire world directly to the only person who knew exactly how to pull the trigger. I was not going to run away from the biotechnology firm. I was not going to hide in my tiny, unheated cubicle and cry. I was going to meticulously pack this massive mountain of federal evidence into a highly unstable digital bomb. I was going to secretly wire it directly into the main visual display of the executive boardroom. And on Friday morning, when all the global investors and federal regulators were sitting comfortably in their expensive leather chairs, I was going to gladly watch Julian Pierce detonate his entire life completely by himself. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my laptop. The paralyzing fear was completely gone now, replaced by a cold and absolute focus. I opened a brand new secure terminal window and began to write the final sequence of my trap. I was not going to simply leak the stolen documents to the press or hand them over to the federal authorities. That would give Julian too much time to prepare his highly paid corporate lawyers and spin a massive web of lies. I needed a public execution. I needed him to pull the trigger himself right in front of the people he was trying to rob. My fingers flew across the plastic keyboard, stringing together lines of complex and highly aggressive code. I was building a custom trigger protocol. It was a massive digital landmine designed to bury itself deep within the primary presentation software of the corporate mainframe. I coded it to remain completely dormant and invisible. The internal security scanners would never detect it because I disguised the lethal payload as a standard visual formatting update. It would sit absolutely silently in the dark, waiting for one highly specific query command to wake it up. I knew exactly how Julian operated in these high-stakes boardroom meetings. He loved to perform for his wealthy audience. He loved to stand in front of the massive glass screens and dramatically type the final predictive query himself, just to show the Wall Street investors how brilliantly the artificial intelligence worked. I hardwired my trigger code to recognize that exact sequence of arrogant keystrokes. The moment Julian confidently typed his final search command on Friday morning, my hidden ghost protocol would instantly activate. I wrote the execution sequence with absolute ruthless precision. Once the dormant code was triggered, it would immediately execute a total system override. It would instantly lock the entire presentation terminal and completely revoke all administrative privileges inside the executive boardroom. Julian would be entirely locked out of his own machine. He would not be able to close the active window or shut down the computer or even turn off the massive projector screen. And then the final payload would drop. The trigger code was designed to violently rip away the fake corporate interface and expose the absolute naked truth. It would pull the heavily encrypted files from my secure server and plaster them directly onto the main boardroom display. Every single global investor and every single federal regulator sitting in those expensive leather chairs would suddenly be staring at the raw, unedited clinical trial data. They would see the horrific 12% mortality rate. They would see the personal login credentials of Julian Pierce tied directly to the illegal manipulation of the medical files. They would see the absolute undeniable proof of a $2 billion federal fraud flashing in bright red letters across the massive screen. I hit the enter key and watched the green text confirm the successful remote upload. The digital bomb was now fully armed and permanently embedded deep inside the Project Sentinel mainframe. Julian Pierce thought he had chained me to a desk and silenced me forever. But on Friday morning, he was going to walk into that glass boardroom, confidently press a single button on his keyboard, and completely destroy his own empire in front of the entire world. I opened a brand new secure email client on my laptop. I routed the connection through a dozen anonymous proxy servers scattered across the globe. There was absolutely no way the internal security team at the biotechnology firm would ever be able to trace this digital message back to my small, dark apartment. I attached the massive encrypted file containing the raw clinical trial data. But I did not just send the raw numbers. I needed the corporate execution to be absolutely flawless and completely undeniable. I specifically highlighted the master server access logs. I isolated the exact Internet Protocol address of Julian's private computer. I made sure his unique digital signature was highlighted directly at the absolute top of the document. There was no running away from this evidence. His personal machine was the exact weapon used to manipulate the lethal medical data and commit the massive federal fraud. I moved my cursor up to the blank recipient line. I typed in two highly specific and incredibly powerful email addresses. The first address belonged to Richard Sterling, the founding chief executive officer of Origen. He was a ruthless corporate giant who cared about absolutely nothing except the public stock price of his company. He would instantly destroy anyone who threatened his empire. The second address belonged to Elias Thorne, the lead managing director of the massive global investment fund. He was the man actively holding the $2 billion check. If there was one thing Elias Thorne hated more than losing his money, it was being made to look like an absolute fool by a greedy subordinate. These two men possessed the limitless financial and legal power to completely erase Julian from the corporate world forever. I did not hit the send button right away. I clicked on the automated delivery schedule function. A small calendar popped up on my glowing screen. I selected Friday. I carefully set the exact delivery time for 8 o'clock in the morning. That was exactly 30 minutes before Julian was scheduled to step into the massive glass boardroom and begin his arrogant presentation. It was the absolute perfect window of time. It was just enough time for the chief executive officer and the lead investor to read the horrifying truth on their private phones. But it was not enough time for Julian to intercept the message or realize the massive trap had already violently closed around his neck. I stared at the digital clock on the monitor, watching the seconds slowly tick by in the silent room. I reached out and firmly pressed the enter key to lock in the scheduled delivery. The confirmation window flashed bright green and then disappeared entirely into the digital void. The primary explosive was successfully wired into the presentation screen, and the secondary missiles were officially in the air. I leaned back in my wooden chair and slowly closed the heavy lid of my laptop. The screen went completely black, plunging the small apartment back into total absolute darkness. Julian thought he had completely destroyed my life today, but he was just a dead man walking toward a glass stage. The irreversible countdown had officially begun. Friday morning finally arrived. The massive glass boardroom on the 50th floor of the corporate tower was completely packed with the most powerful financial predators in the country. The air was incredibly thick with the smell of expensive corporate coffee and the overwhelming arrogance of Wall Street billionaires. I stood silently in the absolute back corner of the room, perfectly playing the role of the broken and obedient technical assistant. I was holding a digital tablet against my chest, keeping my eyes lowered and my face completely blank. Julian Pierce walked confidently to the front of the massive room. He looked absolutely flawless. He was wearing a brand-new bespoke navy suit that was tailored to absolute perfection. His hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated pure dominant authority. He looked exactly like the brilliant tech visionary he was desperately pretending to be. He flashed his signature charismatic smile, and the entire room immediately fell completely silent. They were all completely mesmerized by his manufactured charm. Julian began his presentation with absolute flawless execution. He spoke with a smooth and completely untroubled rhythm. He did not stutter a single time. He paced slowly back and forth across the polished wooden floor, gesturing gracefully toward the massive glass projector screen. He began to explain the foundational architecture of Project Sentinel. He used all of my highly complex mathematical terminology. He casually threw around advanced machine learning concepts that he did not actually understand. He was flawlessly reciting the exact script he had forced me to write for him. He told the Wall Street investors about the agonizing late nights he had spent coding the neural network. He fabricated a deeply moving story about his personal dedication to solving severe neurological diseases. He claimed absolute sole ownership of every single brilliant breakthrough, and the wealthy executives sitting in the heavy leather chairs swallowed every single lie without a second of hesitation. They nodded their heads in profound respect. They whispered quietly to each other, completely amazed by the sheer genius of the man standing in front of them. Elias Thorne, the lead managing director of the massive global investment fund, was sitting directly at the head of the heavy mahogany table. He was leaning forward with his hands clasped tightly together, completely captivated by Julian. Richard Sterling, our ruthless chief executive officer, was sitting right next to him, beaming with absolute corporate pride. There were even representatives from the Food and Drug Administration sitting near the back. They were taking diligent notes on their secure tablets, completely unaware that they were being fed highly toxic and lethal lies. Julian was looking directly at federal agents and lying to their faces without a single drop of sweat on his forehead. The sheer sociopathic nature of his performance was truly breathtaking to witness. He was completely drunk on his own absolute power. Julian clicked a small black remote in his hand, and the massive screen behind him shifted to a beautiful array of colorful data charts. These were the manipulated clinical trial results. He was boldly projecting the massive federal fraud directly into the retinas of the federal regulators. He pointed confidently to a bright green line soaring upward on the graph. He told the room that the experimental neurological drug was showing an unprecedented 99% safety rating. He completely erased the 12% mortality rate with a simple wave of his expensive hand. He was actively burying dead patients under a mountain of fake corporate success, and the entire room was actively applauding him for it. I watched him bask in the absolute glory of his massive crime. He actually paused his presentation for a brief second to soak in the verbal praise coming from the Wall Street giants. A prominent investor from a massive hedge fund complimented Julian on his unparalleled analytical vision. Julian bowed his head with fake absolute humility and thanked the man. He was swimming in a massive ocean of stolen validation. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the non-disclosure agreement and the massive financial bribe to my family had permanently secured his massive empire. Julian turned his head slightly and locked his dark eyes directly onto me in the back of the room. He offered me a very small and incredibly cruel smirk. It was a private message sent entirely through a single look. He was reminding me of my absolute defeat. He was showing me that he had completely won the war and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop him. He wanted me to actively choke on my own silence while he stole my entire life right in front of the entire world. But my hands did not shake. My heart did not race. I just stared right back at him with absolutely dead eyes. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The anonymous emails containing the absolute proof of his federal fraud had successfully landed in the private inboxes of Richard Sterling and Elias Thorne exactly 45 minutes ago. The trigger code was completely armed and waiting patiently in the dark background of the presentation software. Julian was standing at the absolute highest peak of his entire corporate career, completely unaware that he was standing on top of a massive, active digital landmine. The stage was perfectly set, and the thief was completely ready to hang himself. I stood quietly in this absolute darkest corner of the massive glass boardroom. I was perfectly playing the role of the silent and obedient shadow that Julian had forcefully designed for me. My finger rested lightly on the plastic button of the presentation remote. Every time Julian paused to take a dramatic breath, I pressed the button to advance the slide perfectly, syncing my movements with his arrogant rhythm. I was nothing more than a human machine operating entirely in the background while he soaked in the blinding spotlight. He paced smoothly across the front of the room, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire and federal regulator in the audience. And every few minutes he would slightly turn his head and cast a quick glance directly into my dark corner. Whenever our eyes met, a slow and incredibly triumphant smile would spread across his face. It was a deeply private and toxic victory lap. He was silently mocking me in front of the entire world, knowing that I was the one manually feeding the fake slides onto the massive screen. He genuinely thought my silence was absolute proof of my total surrender. He thought he had completely crushed my spirit and turned me into a permanent ghost inside my own masterpiece. He continued to charm the wealthy executives completely blind to the reality of the situation. I kept my face entirely blank and simply pressed the button again, feeding him the exact next slide he asked for. I let him enjoy his massive delusion for just a little bit longer. I let him smile and gloat, completely unaware that with every single click of my remote, I was actively pushing him one step closer to the absolute edge of the cliff. The presentation was moving exactly according to Julian Pierce and his flawless corporate script. He was painting a beautiful and completely fake masterpiece right in front of the most powerful people in the medical technology industry. The massive glass boardroom was completely hypnotized by his deep and rhythmic voice. He was just moments away from securing the massive $2 billion check. He turned his back to the long mahogany table and pointed toward the final projection slide. I was getting ready to deliver his massive closing statement. The room was so quiet you could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. But then the invisible digital timer finally reached 0. Elias Thorne was sitting directly in the center of the room. He had been leaning forward for the entire hour, completely captivated by the presentation. But suddenly a silent notification flashed brightly across the screen of the silver tablet resting on the table directly in front of him. It was a high-priority encrypted email routed directly to his private server. I watched from the dark corner of the room as he slowly lowered his chin and looked down at the glowing screen. At first, his expression remained completely neutral. He simply tapped the glass surface to open the anonymous message. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was staring at the raw, unedited clinical trial logs. He was looking at the massive red flag indicating a 12% human mortality rate. He was reading the absolute, undeniable proof that the experimental drug they were about to fund was highly lethal. The physical transformation in the lead investor was completely terrifying to witness. The polite corporate smile instantly vanished from his face. His heavy gray eyebrows pulled tightly together, forming a deep and aggressive frown. The relaxed posture of a wealthy billionaire instantly hardened into the rigid stance of a ruthless financial predator who realized he was being robbed. He scrolled rapidly down the glowing screen. His eyes darted aggressively back and forth, reading the complex server access logs. He was looking directly at the Internet Protocol address that permanently tied the lethal medical fraud directly to Julian Pierce. The temperature in the massive boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. The heavy silence in the room was no longer born of respect. It was suddenly filled with extreme and lethal tension. Elias Thorne did not say a single word at first. He simply reached out and firmly tapped the shoulder of Richard Sterling, sitting right next to him. The chief executive officer turned his head in confusion. Thorne did not speak. He just slid the glowing tablet exactly 3 inches across the polished wood table. Richard Sterling looked down at the screen. I watched the blood completely drain from the face of the ruthless corporate giant. His skin turned the color of pale ash. He stared at the undeniable proof of massive federal fraud happening inside his own company. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at Julian with eyes completely filled with absolute corporate murder. Julian was completely oblivious to the silent execution happening right behind his back. He was still staring at the massive projector screen, confidently explaining how the neural network had completely eliminated all severe medical side effects. He was smiling and gesturing with his expensive hands, completely drunk on his own fake genius. He was standing on the absolute peak of the mountain, entirely blind to the massive avalanche crashing down right above his head. I took a deep breath and prepared to transition to the live system demonstration. He walked smoothly over to the central computer terminal to execute the final search query. But before his fingers could even touch the plastic keyboard, a heavy and completely commanding voice echoed across the massive boardroom. "Stop the presentation right now." The voice belonged to Elias Thorne. It was not a polite corporate request. It was an absolute and violent demand. The words hit the silent room like a heavy physical blow. Julian froze completely in place. His charismatic smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he forcefully plastered it back onto his face. He turned slowly around to face the long mahogany table. He looked slightly confused, but he was desperately trying to maintain his dominant executive persona. He let out a small and polite chuckle that sounded completely hollow in the freezing room. "Is there a problem, Elias?" Julian asked smoothly. "I was just about to initialize the live predictive query, so you can see the artificial intelligence function in real time." Elias Thorne did not smile back. He leaned back slowly in his heavy leather chair and folded his hands carefully on top of the wooden table. He looked at Julian like he was studying a completely dead insect on the bottom of his expensive shoe. The silence stretched out for several agonizing seconds. "I have a very specific question about your data security protocols, Julian," Thorne said in a low and incredibly dangerous tone. "I am looking at a highly interesting document that just arrived on my private server. It appears to be a raw internal system log from Project Sentinel." I watched Julian closely from the dark corner. A tiny bead of cold sweat instantly materialized right at the edge of his perfectly styled hairline. His brain was desperately trying to calculate how a raw system log could possibly be in the hands of the lead investor. He swallowed hard, but his voice remained incredibly steady. He was a professional liar refusing to break character. "I am not sure what document you are referring to, Elias," Julian replied smoothly, "but I can assure you that all of our clinical data is heavily encrypted and verified by multiple internal security teams. There are no raw logs missing from our secure database." Thorne stared at him with absolute dead eyes. Then explain to me why this raw server log shows a 12% catastrophic mortality rate in the human control group. And please explain why the unique Internet Protocol address tied to the manual deletion of those deceased patients matches your personal executive office computer. The fatal question hung in the air like a massive execution blade. The entire room stopped breathing completely. The representatives from the Food and Drug Administration immediately sat up perfectly straight in their chairs and grabbed their secure digital tablets. The other Wall Street investors began whispering aggressively to each other. The beautiful illusion of the brilliant tech visionary shattered into a million sharp pieces in a single devastating moment. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His face turned completely pale, and his expensive bespoke suit suddenly looked entirely too big for his shaking body. His confident posture completely collapsed. He looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. He was completely trapped in a massive cage of his own creation. He had absolutely no idea how the buried medical files had escaped the secure internal server. He looked directly at me standing in the dark corner. His eyes were wide with pure panic and absolute terror. He was silently begging me to step forward and fix the massive digital disaster. He was commanding me to take the blame just like we had agreed in the forced contract. But I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I just stared right back at him with a cold and empty expression. The massive explosive charge had successfully detonated right in his face. And the absolute best part of my brilliant trap was still waiting quietly in the dark for him to touch the keyboard. Elias Thorne slowly reached up and removed his thick wire-framed glasses. He folded them with absolute terrifying precision and placed them softly on the polished mahogany table. The silence in the massive boardroom was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight crushing against the thick glass walls. Thorne leaned forward in his heavy leather chair and stared directly into Julian's terrified eyes. "The algorithm is absolutely fantastic," Mr. Pierce Thorne said in a voice completely devoid of any human emotion. It was the cold and mechanical voice of a billionaire executioner. "But I need you to explain something to me right now. Please explain to this entire room the exact core mathematical mechanism that this predictive model uses to actively filter out the hidden mortality variables in Phase 3 of your clinical trials." The fatal question hit the silent room like a massive shockwave. Julian swallowed hard. The remaining color completely vanished from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale and terrified mask. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by absolute sheer panic. He did not know the answer. He could not possibly know the mathematical answer because he did not write a single line of that complex neural architecture. I had built every single data pathway and every single predictive node in total isolation. Julian had only memorized the shallow corporate marketing script I had been legally forced to write for him. He was nothing but a greedy corporate salesman pretending to be a brilliant software engineer. And Elias Thorne had just ordered him to explain the absolute deepest and darkest layer of the digital ocean. Julian looked frantically at the glowing projection screen and then looked desperately back at the ruthless billionaire. The federal regulators from the Food and Drug Administration were staring directly at him, waiting patiently for a highly technical explanation that he simply did not possess. The deafening silence dragged on for 10 absolute agonizing seconds. I watched from the dark shadows of the room as heavy beads of cold sweat slowly gathered on his forehead and dripped down the side of his perfectly styled face. His bespoke navy suit suddenly offered him absolutely no protection. He shifted his weight nervously from one expensive shoe to the other. His brain was desperately misfiring, trying to invent a plausible technical lie to satisfy the most powerful men in the financial industry. But there was absolutely no corporate buzzword that could explain away a deliberately hidden 12% death rate. He was completely suffocating in the thin boardroom air. He was a pathetic fraud aggressively drowning in a massive sea of his own lies right in front of the entire world. Julian completely froze in the center of the massive room. His mouth opened and closed several times, but absolutely no sound came out. The heavy beads of cold sweat on his forehead began to run aggressively down his pale cheeks and soaked directly into the expensive collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He was completely trapped under the burning spotlight of the federal regulators and the wealthy billionaires. He desperately tried to pull himself together and fall back on his standard corporate training. He started to stammer through a pathetic wall of empty technical buzzwords. He desperately talked about cloud-based synergy and dynamic machine learning paradigms and optimized neural pathways. He was throwing meaningless corporate garbage into the dead silence of the room, hoping it would magically blind them to the massive federal fraud. But Elias Thorne was completely immune to the pathetic verbal performance. The lead investor slammed his heavy hand directly onto the polished mahogany table with a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He aggressively ordered Julian to stop talking in meaningless circles. The ruthless billionaire leaned entirely forward in his heavy leather chair and pointed a highly aggressive finger directly at the central computer terminal. He told Julian to stop hiding behind fake marketing presentations. He demanded that Julian open the raw command terminal on the main projector screen and run a live mathematical simulation of the core algorithm right in front of the entire boardroom right now. Julian looked like a man who had just been forcefully pushed out of an airplane without a parachute. He was completely shaking as he slowly turned his body toward the computer terminal. He knew exactly what was waiting for him inside that machine. If he opened the raw command terminal, he would have to manually type the highly complex execution code. He would have to prove to the entire world that he actually understood the artificial intelligence he claimed to have built. The trap was completely unavoidable now. He had absolutely no choice but to step forward and place his shaking hands directly onto the plastic keyboard. Julian stared completely blankly at the glowing plastic keyboard. His expensive leather shoes felt like they were permanently glued to the polished wooden floor. The massive glass boardroom was completely silent, except for the heavy and rapid sound of his own breathing. He was entirely trapped. If he refused to run the simulation, the federal regulators would immediately arrest him for corporate fraud. But if he touched the computer, he would expose his absolute technical ignorance to the entire world. The heavy silence was actively crushing him alive. He looked out at the sea of ruthless billionaires and angry federal agents. They were all staring right back at him with absolute zero mercy. The flawless corporate illusion was completely shattered. He needed a miracle. He needed someone to absorb the massive impact of the crashing plane. And that is exactly when his desperate eyes found me again, standing completely still in the dark shadows of the room. He swallowed incredibly hard and forced a weak and completely pathetic smile onto his wet face. He cleared his throat, trying desperately to find his deep, commanding voice, but it sounded completely broken and hollow. He turned slightly towards the investors and gestured weakly in my direction. He told the boardroom that the raw command interface was highly sensitive and required a very specific physical input protocol. He lied and said he wanted his lead technical assistant to handle the manual execution, just to ensure absolute maximum efficiency. He looked directly at me and ordered me to step forward. He called my name in front of the entire room. His tone was perfectly crafted to sound like a normal corporate instruction, but his dark eyes were screaming in absolute pure panic. He was silently begging me to save his life. He genuinely believed that the heavy chains of massive financial debt and the strict non-disclosure agreement would force me to fix this disaster. I thought the $5 million real estate trap he built for Marcus and my father, expensive medical bills, would guarantee my absolute total compliance. He thought I would quietly walk up to the machine and type a fake diagnostic command to cover up his massive deadly crime. I did not immediately move. I let him hang in the absolute dead silence for 5 full seconds. I wanted him to feel the exact agonizing weight of his own helpless reality. I wanted the cold terror to sink completely into his bones. Then I slowly stepped out of the dark corner and walked right into the blinding bright light of the corporate spotlight. My footsteps echoed loudly across the polished floor. I did not look at the wealthy billionaires or the angry federal agents. I kept my eyes completely locked onto Julian Pierce. He was physically shaking as I approached the massive central console. He took a tiny step backward, giving me direct physical access to the main computer terminal. As I stood directly next to him, I could actually smell the sharp metallic scent of his cold sweat mixing with his expensive designer cologne. He leaned in very close to my ear so the federal regulators could not hear him. He whispered a desperate and aggressive threat. He told me to fix the simulation right now, or he would completely destroy my entire family by noon. It was the absolute pathetic gasp of a dying animal trying to look dangerous. I did not flinch, and I did not say a single word in response to his empty threat. I simply turned my head and looked directly at the massive glass projector screen. The raw command terminal was completely blank and waiting patiently for an input. My beautiful ghost protocol was sleeping silently just beneath the digital surface. It was heavily loaded with the raw, unedited clinical trial data. It was packed with the 12% human mortality rate and his absolute undeniable digital signatures. I slowly raised my hands and placed my fingers softly onto the smooth plastic keys. Julian let out a quiet sigh of massive relief right next to me. He actually believed his pathetic domestic threats had worked. He thought I was going to quietly surrender and protect his $2 billion empire. He had absolutely no idea that I was not a captive assistant trying to fix a broken machine. I was an executioner standing directly over the absolute final switch. I rested my fingertips softly on the smooth plastic keys. The heavy and suffocating mask of the obedient victim completely dissolved from my face in a single instant. I stopped shrinking into my own shoulders. I stood up perfectly straight and lifted my chin. I finally took a deep and completely unrestricted breath of the cold boardroom air. The absolute total shift in my physical demeanor was completely lost on Julian. He was standing far too close to me, entirely blinded by his own desperate panic. He genuinely thought my steady hands were a clear sign of absolute submission to his massive financial leverage. He thought I was quietly accepting my tragic fate as his permanent corporate slave. But I was not logging into the standard diagnostic menu. I did not even glance at his fake presentation files. My fingers began to move rapidly across the keyboard. The rhythmic tapping of the plastic keys echoed loudly in the absolutely silent room. I was not entering the secure administrative override he was expecting. I was aggressively punching in the highly specific and deeply hidden sequence of my ghost protocol. It was a brilliantly complex string of execution commands that I had permanently burned into my memory. Every single deliberate keystroke was a massive physical release of all the quiet rage and all the toxic humiliation I had been forced to swallow over the past 6 months. Julian looked down at the glowing monitor. The tiny bit of color that had returned to his face instantly vanished entirely. His false sense of relief completely evaporated into the freezing air. He stared at the black terminal window with wide and uncomprehending eyes. He did not recognize a single line of the highly aggressive code rapidly populating the screen. His arrogant brain began to violently misfire as the terrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down on top of him. He realized with absolute certainty that I was not typing a rescue command to save his pathetic career. He watched my hands move with lethal precision as I actively struck the final digital match to burn his entire stolen empire right to the ground. I reached the absolute end of the hidden sequence and hovered my right index finger directly over the heavy enter key. Julian finally understood the massive destruction unfolding right in front of his eyes. The absolute panic completely shattered his carefully constructed executive persona. He lunged forcefully toward the central computer console with both of his expensive hands reaching aggressively for the plastic keyboard. He screamed loudly in the freezing boardroom, demanding to know exactly what I was doing. His voice cracked with pure terror as he ordered me to stop immediately. The wealthy billionaires and the federal regulators physically jumped in their heavy leather chairs, completely shocked by his sudden violent outburst. The perfect corporate silence was completely destroyed by the sound of a desperate man watching his entire life violently burn to the ground. But his frantic physical reaction was entirely too late. He was moving in absolute slow motion compared to the massive adrenaline pumping violently through my own veins. Before his shaking fingers could even brush against the edge of the smooth computer terminal, I pushed my right index finger down directly onto the heavy enter key. I pressed it with absolute permanent finality. A loud and highly satisfying mechanical click echoed sharply across the narrow space between us. The physical reaction from the massive corporate mainframe was completely instantaneous. A highly aggressive red flash violently illuminated the entire glass boardroom as the primary projector screen flickered and died for a fraction of a second. Julian slammed his hands helplessly onto the plastic keyboard, desperately mashing the escape key over and over again. He was crying out in pure panic, begging the machine to abort the digital command. But the artificial intelligence was completely deaf to his pathetic cries. My hidden ghost protocol had instantly engaged the total system lockdown. The administrative privileges were permanently revoked, and every single internal security wall violently slammed shut. The entire network was entirely frozen, locking him completely out of his own stolen empire. He stood there breathing heavily and staring at the locked terminal while his massive federal crimes prepared to violently explode onto the massive glass wall right behind him. I slowly stepped back from the computer console and let my hands fall calmly to my sides. I looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes and watched his arrogant soul completely leave his physical body. There was absolutely no corporate lawyer or financial bribe that could save him now. The irreversible digital avalanche was finally unleashed, and he was standing directly in the absolute center of the absolute blast zone. The massive glass projector screen covering the entire back wall of the boardroom violently flashed a blinding and aggressive crimson red. The sudden burst of intense light completely washed over the shocked faces of the wealthy investors and federal regulators. The internal corporate system executed a total and irreversible hard lock. Julian continued to smash his shaking fists against the plastic keyboard, but the machine was completely dead to his frantic commands. He had absolutely zero control over the massive display towering right behind him. The fake, beautiful data charts and the manipulated safety graphs instantly vanished from the glass wall entirely. The bright red background stabilized, and massive block letters in pure, blinding white began to violently type themselves across the center of the screen. The first line of text hit the silent boardroom like a heavy physical shockwave. It read, "Original System Copyright, Chloe Jenkins." Julian slowly turned his shaking head and looked up at the massive glowing letters. His jaw dropped open in absolute pure horror. The second line of text slammed onto the screen, even larger and brighter than the first. It read, "Warning, critical clinical data has been intentionally forged and manipulated by Julian Pierce." The wealthy billionaires, sitting at the heavy mahogany table, physically recoiled in their expensive leather chairs. The federal agents from the Food and Drug Administration immediately stood up and grabbed their secure communication devices. But the devastating digital execution was not over yet. The final line of text violently crashed onto the massive screen, completely shattering the dead silence of the room. It read, "Actual human mortality rate, 12%. The massive white letters burned directly into the retinas of every single person in the room. The lethal medical truth was towering 50 feet tall, right behind the arrogant executive who had desperately tried to bury it. There was absolutely no corporate marketing spin that could possibly erase those glowing white words. The fake, brilliant tech visionary was completely exposed as a desperate fraud and a highly dangerous federal criminal. The massive $2 billion empire had officially collapsed in a spectacular digital explosion, and everyone in the entire world was watching it burn. The absolute dead silence inside the massive glass boardroom finally shattered into a million loud and chaotic pieces. The sheer magnitude of the glowing red projection screen completely destroyed any remaining sense of professional corporate decorum. The wealthy Wall Street billionaires instantly erupted into absolute pure panic. Expensive leather chairs were violently pushed backward across the polished wooden floor. Shouts of sheer outrage and deep financial terror bounced aggressively off the thick glass walls. The federal agents from the Food and Drug Administration were practically shouting into their secure digital devices, demanding immediate backup from their field offices. Julian stood completely paralyzed in the absolute center of the massive storm. His expensive bespoke suit was completely soaked in cold sweat, and his arrogant jaw was hanging perfectly slack. He looked frantically around the room, desperately hoping someone would offer him a tiny shred of corporate mercy. But the final killing blow did not come from me. It came directly from the absolute top of the corporate food chain. Richard Sterling, the founding chief executive officer of Origen, slammed both of his heavy fists directly onto the polished mahogany table. The massive physical crack echoed like a loud explosion, completely silencing the panicked billionaires in a single second. The ruthless corporate giant stood up from his heavy leather chair and straightened his expensive silk tie. He did not look at Julian. He completely ignored the terrified executive standing right in front of him. To Richard Sterling, Julian Pierce was already a completely dead man and a massive legal liability that needed to be surgically removed from the company. Sterling turned his cold and completely empty eyes directly toward Elias Thorne and the federal regulators. He spoke in a massive, booming voice that completely commanded the entire room. He told the lead investor that there was no need to panic about the $2 billion massive financial deal. Sterling calmly announced that the executive board had received a highly encrypted anonymous email containing the exact same raw clinical data at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. He stated very clearly that his internal security team had spent the last hour actively verifying the digital signatures and confirming the horrific 12% mortality rate. Julian let out a pathetic and entirely broken gasp. He finally realized that the lethal trap had completely snapped shut around his neck long before he even walked into the boardroom. He had spent the entire morning happily digging his own grave while the chief executive officer silently watched him do it. Sterling raised his heavy hand and pointed directly at the thick glass doors at the back of the massive room. He told the federal agents that the company was fully cooperating with the law. He announced that he had personally called the federal authorities the absolute second the medical fraud was legally verified. The heavy glass doors suddenly swung violently open, and a large team of armed federal agents in dark windbreakers stepped directly into the boardroom. The corporate execution was finally complete. The heavy glass doors at the back of the massive boardroom swung open with absolute brutal force. Two highly intimidating federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets marched straight into the room, heavily flanked by the armed corporate building security team. They did not hesitate or pause for a single second. They walked aggressively past the panicked Wall Street billionaires and moved straight toward the center of the room. Julian was still standing completely frozen in front of the glowing red projection screen, completely paralyzed by his massive digital execution. One of the federal agents forcefully grabbed his expensive tailored shoulder and violently spun him around. The loud and highly satisfying metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed beautifully across the massive glass boardroom. The leading agent looked directly into his terrified eyes and loudly announced the massive list of criminal charges. He was being officially arrested on the spot for orchestrating massive federal securities fraud and intentionally committing severe criminal violations against the Food and Drug Administration. Julian looked absolutely pathetic as his shaking hands were forcefully locked tightly behind his back. His entire brilliant corporate empire was completely reduced to a cold pair of federal chains in less than 5 minutes. I slowly shifted my gaze across the panicked room and found Vanessa, the highly arrogant human resources director, who had aggressively helped Julian build my legal cage. She was standing perfectly still near the heavy mahogany table, and all the warm color had completely drained out of her face. She looked exactly like a terrified and shaking ghost. Richard Sterling looked directly at her and coldly announced that she was immediately suspended from the biotechnology firm without pay. He told the federal agents that she was the primary accomplice who actively manipulated the internal corporate employment records to conceal the massive criminal enterprise. She physically collapsed back into her heavy leather chair, completely trembling in absolute terror. She finally realized she was going to a maximum security federal prison right alongside the arrogant executive she had blindly protected. I stood quietly in the dark corner of the room and watched the massive corporate house of cards violently crash all the way down to the polished wooden floor. Every single person who had conspired to steal my life was now actively drowning in the exact same toxic ocean they had built for me. The two heavy federal agents grabbed Julian tightly by the arms and began to physically drag him toward the thick glass doors. His expensive leather shoes slipped wildly against the polished wooden floor. All of his calculated executive charm and his absolute arrogant pride completely vanished in a single instant. He devolved into a completely pathetic and desperate animal right in front of the wealthy billionaires. He started thrashing aggressively against the heavy steel handcuffs and screaming my name at the absolute top of his lungs. He was crying hysterically and begging me to tell the federal regulators that the massive clinical fraud was simply a terrible artificial intelligence error. He shouted that I could easily fix the digital matrix and rewrite the safety protocols to save his massive empire. He was openly pleading for corporate mercy in front of the exact same people he had tried to violently impress just 10 minutes ago. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still in the quiet shadows of the massive boardroom and watched him physically fall completely apart. I did not feel a single drop of human pity for the terrified man violently screaming my name. The heavy emotional chains he had wrapped tightly around my throat for the past 6 months were permanently broken. I looked directly into his red and heavily swollen eyes. My expression was completely frozen and exactly as cold as absolute solid ice. The federal agents paused for just a fraction of a second near the heavy glass doors, struggling to safely control his violent physical thrashing. Julian stared at me with absolute sheer desperation, desperately hoping for a tiny spark of hesitation or a sudden dramatic rescue. I looked right back at him and delivered my final absolute truth. I told him in a remarkably calm and completely dead voice that he aggressively dug his own massive grave. I told him I simply threw him the heavy steel shovel. The pure absolute devastation crashed heavily across his sweaty and pale face. He finally realized that the brilliant system architect he had ruthlessly abused was the exact same person who completely engineered his massive federal destruction. He opened his mouth to violently scream again, but the federal agents forcefully jerked him forward and dragged him completely out of the massive glass boardroom. The heavy doors swung firmly shut, completely cutting off the pathetic sound of his broken sobbing. The massive toxic nightmare was officially over, and I was finally completely free. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, and the massive boardroom fell into a strange and heavy silence. The terrified Wall Street investors were completely frozen in their expensive leather chairs. Richard Sterling slowly turned away from the door and looked directly at me. He did not look angry, and he did not look surprised. He looked like a ruthless predator who had just watched a much smaller animal successfully hunt a highly dangerous beast. He smoothly dismissed the federal regulators and politely asked the wealthy billionaires to clear the room. Within 5 minutes, the massive glass space was completely empty, except for the two of us. I stood entirely still near the central computer terminal, waiting for the absolute highest authority in the company to deliver my final judgment. I had successfully destroyed his rogue vice president, but I had also aggressively exposed his flagship medical product to the federal government. Sterling walked slowly around the heavy mahogany table and stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He looked deeply into my eyes and told me he had spent the entire morning reviewing my actual clinical algorithms. He knew exactly what Julian had done, and he knew exactly how brilliantly I had engineered the Ghost Protocol to expose the massive fraud. He did not care about the temporary stock dive or the massive public relations nightmare. He only cared about the pure absolute power of the artificial intelligence I had built with my own hands. He spoke in a cold and highly calculated voice. He told me that the company desperately needed a completely clean slate and a brilliant technical visionary who could not be manipulated or controlled by anyone. That exact same afternoon, I was permanently moved out of the dark basement server room and relocated to the absolute top floor of the massive corporate tower. Sterling officially promoted me to the executive role of Global Director of Artificial Intelligence, effective immediately. He did not just give me a new corporate title to secure my absolute loyalty. He forcefully shoved a massive legal contract across his polished wooden desk. The new executive compensation package was absolutely staggering. He quadrupled my previous engineering salary and handed me a massive portfolio of premium corporate stock options. But the massive financial numbers on the crisp white paper meant absolutely nothing compared to the true victory I had finally achieved. I picked up the expensive metal pen and signed my name on the solid black line. In that single defining moment, the heavy iron chains of my toxic family debt were completely vaporized. The crushing medical bills that Julian had aggressively used to blackmail me and enslave my entire existence were permanently erased. I finally had enough clean and highly legitimate money to pay for my father and his expensive hospital treatments for the rest of his natural life. I walked out of the massive executive suite and looked down at the sprawling city far below me. I was no longer a desperate victim trapped in a highly toxic corporate basement. I was the absolute master of the machine, and I had completely won the war. I stepped into the private executive elevator, and the heavy steel doors slid silently shut. The exact second I was completely alone, my cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my coat pocket. It was a massive and unrelenting wave of absolute sheer panic transmitting directly through the digital network. I slowly pulled the glowing glass rectangle from my pocket and stared at the chaotic avalanche of incoming notifications. Marcus was desperately calling me over and over again. The digital screen showed 42 missed calls in less than 30 minutes. His perfect and highly arrogant life was completely unraveling in real time. The massive federal investigation into Julian Pierce had immediately triggered an aggressive financial freeze on every single account tied to his toxic corporate assets. Marcus and his highly aggressive investment fund were completely locked down by the federal government. His entire fraudulent reputation was instantly reduced to absolute toxic waste. I swiped past his endless, desperate voicemails and opened my overflowing text messages. The absolute total destruction of my highly toxic family was heavily documented in a frantic series of glowing digital words. My spoiled sister Harper had sent a massive wall of angry and terrified messages. Her lavish destination wedding was completely canceled. The massive luxury credit lines that Marcus had arrogantly promised to pay were instantly and completely denied. Her perfect shallow fantasy was violently ripped away because the stolen corporate money was permanently gone. She was fiercely blaming me for destroying her perfectly curated social image, but her arrogant rage was completely useless now. But the absolute most pathetic messages came directly from my mother. She sent me dozens of frantic voice notes crying hysterically and begging for my immediate help. The exact same woman who had aggressively demanded I sacrifice my entire career and my entire soul to protect her golden boy was now desperately pleading for my corporate mercy. She told me to call the federal authorities and lie to them. She begged me to aggressively intervene and tell the federal prosecutors that Marcus had absolutely nothing to do with the massive medical fraud. She genuinely believed that my new massive executive power could magically erase his severe criminal liability. She wanted me to build another invisible digital cage and lock myself back inside it, just to save his pathetic and highly illegal career. I stood perfectly still in the smooth descending elevator and watched their desperate words scroll rapidly across the glowing screen. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or a single ounce of familial obligation. They had happily traded my entire existence for their own selfish greed. They had actively handed Julian the heavy chains and watched him lock them tightly around my throat. I slowly pressed the small power button on the side of the glass device. The glowing screen instantly went completely black, cutting off their pathetic digital screaming. I was not going to save them. I was going to let them drown in the exact same cold and unforgiving ocean they had happily pushed me into. I stepped out of the private elevator and walked directly into my massive new corner office. The heavy oak doors clicked quietly shut behind me, sealing me inside a perfectly silent and totally secure sanctuary. I walked slowly across the thick plush carpet and stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I looked out over the sprawling, endless city miles below me. The tiny cars and the rushing people looked completely insignificant from the absolute top of the corporate world. I pulled the heavy glass phone from my pocket one final time. The screen was still frantically lighting up with endless, desperate text messages and hysterical voicemails from the exact people who had aggressively tried to destroy my entire life. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, pure clarity. I slowly unlocked the glowing screen and opened my contact list. I did not type out a massive, angry response to my mother. I did not write a long, emotional paragraph explaining exactly why they were entirely at fault. I did not waste a single second of my new life screaming at Marcus or arguing with my highly spoiled sister. I simply pressed my thumb firmly against the smooth glass and selected the block caller option for every single one of them. One by one, their frantic digital voices were permanently silenced. No dramatic arguments and no desperate final pleas. They thrived on chaotic drama, and they desperately needed my emotional reaction to validate their own toxic existence. But I refused to give them a single drop of my energy ever again. Absolute total silence was the absolute most brutal and permanent punishment I could possibly deliver. I dropped the heavy black phone onto my expensive wooden desk and turned my back to the massive glass window. I was finally breathing clean air, and my new empire was just beginning. They always tell you that family is absolutely everything. They aggressively condition you from birth to believe that blood is a sacred and entirely unbreakable bond. But that is the absolute biggest lie ever constructed by weak people. Toxic individuals will happily use that exact same blind loyalty as a heavy iron chain to keep you permanently trapped inside their dark shadow. They will demand your total personal sacrifice, and they will arrogantly call it love. They will violently strip away your entire self-worth, your massive potential, and your own future, just to feed their endless greed, and they will expect you to thank them for the absolute privilege. I had to learn the absolute hardest way that sharing human genetics with someone does not give them the legal or moral right to completely destroy your life. I had to become entirely ruthless. I had to stop seeing them as my family and start seeing them as highly dangerous variables in a deadly psychological equation. I realized that keeping toxic people in your life simply because you are related is the equivalent of willingly drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. The exact second you completely remove the weak human emotion from the algorithm, the absolute brutal truth becomes perfectly clear. Your own life and your own brilliant mind belong completely to you and absolutely no one else. You must never ever let blind loyalty force you to quietly drown just so a toxic manipulator can safely stay afloat. You have to be willing to cut the heavy rope even if the people holding the other end violently fall into the dark abyss. I burned my entire toxic past directly to the ground, and I built a massive corporate empire right on top of the heavy ashes. I walked away without a single drop of guilt, and I never looked back. So let me ask you a very simple question. Have you ever used pure, undeniable data to completely crush a highly arrogant manipulator? Have you ever flipped the heavy digital script and watched a toxic predator become the ultimate terrified prey? Tell me exactly how you did it in the comments section below.